The man known to history as Albert Einstein was born on the 14th of March 1879 in the city of Ulm, in the south of what was then the German Empire. Ulm was a major urban center of the Kingdom of Württemberg, a major constituent part of the German state in the late 19th century. His father was Hermann Einstein, an Ashkenazi Jew from Buchau in Württemberg. Hermann had been academically gifted and showed a strong ability in the field of applied mathematics when studying in Stuttgart, the capital of Württemberg, in his youth. However, the Einstein family were not wealthy, and he was forced to abandon his studies and went to work in the feather bed shop run by his cousins, Moses and Hermann Levy, in Ulm in the 1870s. Albert's mother was Pauline Koch, a member of a family of German Jews who had developed extensive connections as purveyors and merchants in Württemberg. She married Hermann Einstein in 1876, and Albert was their first child. A daughter, Maya or Maria Einstein, was born 2 years later in 1881. Albert's youth was dictated to a considerable extent by his father's business dealings. When he was still an infant, Hermann Einstein, following the business advice of his brother Jakob, decided to move the family to Munich, the largest city in southern Germany, lying some 170 kilometers to the east of Ulm. This occurred in 1880 as Jakob and Hermann sought to establish Einstein & Co. as an electrical engineering company in Munich, just as the great age of electrification was about to begin sweeping the Western world. There, Albert was enrolled in a Catholic elementary school before being transferred to the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich in 1887. Albert remained there until 1894, but at that stage, the Einsteins were once again uprooted when Hermann and Jakob failed to secure a contract to begin the electrification of Munich. Instead, they headed for northern Italy, settling first in Milan and then in Pavia. Albert briefly remained in Munich to continue his studies, but after several months became disillusioned with the strict rote learning on offer at the gymnasium and convinced both his parents and the school authorities to let him leave to join them in Italy. Albert continued his education in Italy from 1894 onwards. He was already showing distinct signs of a precocious ability as a scientist and mathematician, although his father desired for him to take a more keen interest in applied engineering and so follow him into the family business. In Munich in the summer of 1891, he had taught himself algebra and the advanced geometry of the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid. A family tutor by the name of Max Talmud, who excelled himself in the fields of optometry and ophthalmology, was employed by the Einsteins to teach young Albert advanced mathematics and scientific principles, but he soon found his charge was becoming more knowledgeable than he himself was when it came to subjects such as calculus, algebra, and geometry. Nor was he a prodigy who was solely interested in scientific and mathematical topics. As he entered his teenage years, he was also reading widely of some of the most advanced philosophical writers of the 18th and 19th centuries, notably the German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, first published in 1781, and offering one of the most analytical discussions of metaphysics, the study of the nature of reality, is one of the densest philosophical tracts ever written. Yet Albert seemed to understand it clearly at age 14, something which bewildered his tutor. Young Einstein's abilities did not go unnoticed by his teachers, tutor, and parents. Thus, shortly after he arrived in Pavia and following his 16th birthday, he was sent to take the entrance exams at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in the city of Zurich, an advanced school of science, mathematics, and engineering. Although he scored high on the technical exams, Albert was not admitted at this time, in part owing to his youth. The following year, he passed the Swiss Matura, an equivalency exam in the country for those who had not gone through the formal schooling process within Switzerland, but wished to complete the secondary education curriculum there. Earlier that year, he had also renounced his German citizenship to avoid being called up for the required military service expected of all young men in the country. Thus it was that as a stateless individual, he finally entered the Polytechnic School in Zurich in the autumn of 1896, age 17. There he would study physics and mathematics, the two subjects which he had demonstrated a prodigious ability in since he was a child. He would remain there for 4 years, eventually acquiring a diploma in 1900. Einstein's years in Zurich were those in which his research interests began to emerge in a fully formed state. He was becoming an eclectic scientist, one who might broadly be categorized as a physicist, but whose area of expertise covered a wide range of topics such as the discovery of an accurate way to measure the dimensions of tiny molecules, a field of endeavor belonging to quantum mechanics, the broad science of describing the physical properties of nature at the atomic and subatomic level. Additionally, he was concerned to measure how light moves. At the time he was beginning to conduct complex research into this subject in turn-of-the-century Zurich, the prevailing view amongst European and North American scientists was that light traveled exclusively in wave patterns. As would become clear in the years that followed, Einstein doubted this theory and believed a further layer of complexity existed within the mechanism whereby light traveled. These and other aspects of advanced physics were at the heart of Einstein's research in his mid-20s. They formed the core of his doctoral thesis, which he was studying for part-time throughout the early 1900s and which he completed in 1905 in Zurich, entitled A New Determination of Molecular Dimensions. His research in the early 1900s was evidently aided by Mileva Marić, a young Serbian mathematician and physicist who had begun attending the Polytechnic School in Zurich around the same time that Einstein had first been granted teaching hours there after finishing top of the class in 1899. Marić was one of only 2 female students attending there at the time. She and Einstein were soon involved in a relationship with each other, and it is now assumed that she contributed to his research, though the exact degree to which she did so is unclear. In any event, her own research was interrupted in the summer of 1901 when she fell pregnant. Marić and Einstein were not yet married by then, and this was a time when having a child out of wedlock was still considered a social scandal. It appears that Mileva returned to her native Serbia to have the child, who was called Liesl in their correspondence after her birth. What happened to her thereafter is unclear. Some sources believe she died from scarlet fever in 1903, but others suggest she was put up for adoption in Serbia. It seems more likely that she died as Marić and Einstein had married in January 1903. They would go on to have 2 further children, a boy, Hans Albert, born in the summer of 1904, and another son, Eduard, in 1910. It may seem peculiar in retrospect, but Albert did not immediately find it easy to find a teaching position upon completing his diploma in Zurich in 1900. He spent the next year and a half trying in vain to acquire a junior-level lecturing and research position in a Central European university, but to no avail. In the meantime, he acquired Swiss citizenship in 1901, finally acquiring statehood after half a decade of theoretically being without a national affiliation. With Swiss citizenship in hand, a family friend and associate from the Polytechnic in Zurich, Max Grossmann, enlisted the aid of his father to get Einstein a post at the Swiss Patent Office in the capital Bern. Here, Einstein worked as a patent assistant examiner. What this effectively meant was that Albert was tasked with assessing the merits of various inventions and devices, which were brought before the patent office by individuals who wanted to have their intellectual ownership of their invention recognized, to ensure credit for the device was given to them and they could benefit financially. Einstein worked there for the next several years. Beyond serving to support his young family, his work focused on many different devices involving electrical conduction and mechanics, and it has been posited that this impacted on Einstein's own research during his formative years. The manner in which Einstein burst forth from almost complete obscurity within the developed world's scientific community to become one of Europe's paramount physicists in the mid-1900s is one of the strangest stories in the history of science. While he was completing his doctoral studies and working in the patent office in Bern in the first half of the 1900s, Einstein was working on a series of papers for publication in the pages of Annalen der Physik, one of the world's leading academic journals for the study of physics, which had been published in Germany from 1799 onwards. This eventually resulted in 4 separate research papers, which were all published in the journal in 1905. Individually, they made major contributions to various fields within the study of physics. Collectively, they have been deemed to represent a revolutionizing of humanity's conception of the molecular and atomic dimensions of the natural world and the development of modern physics. Consequently, 1905 is usually referred to by biographers of Einstein and historians of Western science as the Annus Mirabilis, or miracle year, of Einstein's career. The first of Einstein's 4 papers of 1905 was entitled On a Heuristic Viewpoint Concerning the Production and Transformation of Light, and was published on the 9th of June. This explained what is known as the photoelectric effect for the first time. The photoelectric effect is where electrons are emitted when electromagnetic radiation, such as light, hits off a material or substance. The electrons which are emitted during such a process are called photoelectrons. Up until 1905, when Einstein described this photoelectric effect, the prevailing view amongst physicists was that light traveled much like a wave in the ocean. But Einstein explained that the photoelectric effect meant that light also traveled in what he termed to be a finite number of energy quanta, which moved without dividing, and which could only be absorbed or generated as entities. This not only explained much that was previously unknown about the nature of light and electrons, but had fundamental implications for understanding how light of a certain frequency could bring sufficient energy into play to liberate an electron. This built on work conducted by physicists such as Max Planck in previous years, but Einstein's paper added extensive new details on how energy and light interacted through the photoelectric effect. This had major implications for practical applied physics, and many years later, this discovery would be directly cited when Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics, although it was not until the mid-1920s that his findings were fully accepted amongst physicists. Just 6 weeks after this first paper appeared, Einstein's second paper of 1905, entitled On the Motion of Small Particles Suspended in a Stationary Liquid as Required by the Molecular Kinetic Theory of Heat, was published in Annalen der Physik on the 18th of July. Prior to Einstein's paper, there was no accurate way of measuring the dimensions of molecules, but several scientists in the 19th century, such as John Dalton, had noted that chemical substances tended to combine together or break down in weighted proportions, which suggested that they were all made from an as yet unidentified physical molecule that was common to all things. These unitary molecules are known as atoms today, after a word which had been coined by ancient Greek philosophers of the 6th century BC, who were themselves seeking to understand the nature of existence 2.5 millennia before Einstein's time. Einstein's second 1905 paper showed how these atoms could be measured more comprehensively by using what was termed Brownian motion, whereby particles, in this case pollen, were suspended in a water solution. Einstein's paper, along with a corroborating study produced by the French physicist Jean Perrin in 1908, demonstrated unequivocally that atoms and molecules were real entities, which were the building blocks of existence. Thus, this second paper of 1905 was a major contribution to humanity's acceptance of the existence of atoms and molecules and the emergence of atomic theory as the basis of much of 20th century physics. Einstein's third paper was published just over 2 months later on the 26th of September 1905. This was entitled On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies and focused on the issue of special relativity. This sought to reconcile an equation which the Scottish mathematician and scientist James Clerk Maxwell had devised in the early 1860s regarding electricity and magnetism. Maxwell's equations led to difficulties in how physicists should understand mechanics which occurred close to the speed of light. In response to this problem, Einstein outlined his special theory of relativity, or special relativity, in his 1905 paper. This stated that the speed of light is the same for all observers regardless of the motion of the light source or the observer of the light source. This opposed the idea postulated over 2 centuries earlier by Isaac Newton, which held that the speed of light is not fixed. Moreover, Einstein's special theory of relativity correctly assumed that when 2 objects are involved concerning light, there is no true way of knowing which is in motion and which is not. Einstein had come to this realization while traveling in a streetcar in Bern in the early summer of 1905 and looking at the clock tower in the center of the city. He realized that if his car suddenly started traveling at the speed of light, the clock arms on the clock tower would suddenly appear as though they had stopped. But the clock inside the streetcar would continue to move around as though nothing had happened, because both Einstein and the clock in the streetcar were traveling at the same velocity. Therefore, the speed of movement was relative. If the streetcar had suddenly accelerated to the speed of light, it would not mean that the clock tower had stopped, only that it appeared to have done so relative to the speed which the streetcar was now traveling at. This was the special theory of relativity at work.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes, and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
Einstein's 4th and final paper of his Annus Mirabilis was published on the 21st of November and was entitled, "Does the inertia of a body depend upon its energy context?" Few have heard of that title today, but a great many are familiar with the equation which Einstein pioneered in the paper, E equals mc squared. In brief, what this means is that the energy of a body at rest, defined as E, is equal to its mass, or m, multiplied by the speed of light, the c of the equation, squared. This equivalency equation showed that a massive particle possesses an energy, or rest energy, which is distinct from the kinetic energy of a particle. This would come to be known as the mass-energy equivalence, and highlights how the rest energy of a particle, such as the nucleus of an atom, could be so massive as to result in an enormous amount of light and thermal energy being released if the particle was disturbed sufficiently. As we will see, the practical application of this equation was to have devastating consequences in later decades, and Einstein later grew to regret this aspect of his research. Einstein's 4 papers published during 1905 did not simply constitute breakthroughs in the confined world of academic theoretical physics. His research shaped the application of science to the modern world in the decades that followed. For instance, when you walk up to an automatic door today and it opens in front of you, this is because the sensors used in the doorway react when the photons in the light beams they emit are obstructed, in this case by a moving person. The sensor then tells the door to open. Einstein first explained how photons work. Solar-powered calculators and streetlights that automatically turn on when it gets dark, amongst other innovations, also emerged from his work on light. The special theory of relativity helped lead to the development of global positioning systems, or GPS, over time. Thus, when you switch on Google Maps, it is effectively functioning based partly on research which Einstein published in his Annus Mirabilis papers. And when a nuclear power plant creates massive amounts of energy by harnessing the energy in the nucleus of an atom, they are doing so based on Einstein's discoveries concerning energy and mass equivalence as contained in the equation E equals mc squared. Einstein's groundbreaking research findings, published in 1905, soon came to the attention of the European scientific community. Though at a time when people were still reliant on the circulation of hard copies of academic journals and word of mouth for research to be disseminated, it took a few years for the import of his findings to become clear across Europe. As they did, they transformed his career. By 1908, he gained a teaching post at the University of Bern and was able to leave his position at the patent office. The following year, he was appointed to a new chair of theoretical physics, which had been created at the University of Zurich. He remained there for the next 2 years. During this time, he continued to refine some of the points he had made in his 1905 papers, while also moving on to begin developing the theory of general relativity as an offshoot of his work on special relativity. The theory of general relativity holds that the observable gravitational attraction between two masses results from the warping of space-time by those two masses. This research made major initial contributions to the science of black holes and other mass objects within the universe. In 1911, Einstein left Switzerland after over 15 years there to take up a new position which had been offered to him at the Charles Ferdinand University in Prague, the oldest university in what is now Czechia, but which was then a constituent part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In tandem, he was offered Austrian citizenship. Although he spent just over a year there, he published upwards of a dozen papers on topics such as the mathematics of radiation, quantum theory, and gravitation. Before long, a new offer pulled him back to Switzerland. This was an invitation to teach at his old alma mater, the Polytechnic School in Zurich. He was there by the summer of 1912 and would spend the next year lecturing to classes who were increasingly familiar with the growing fame of the German physicist, while also researching problems on gravitation and molecular heat. Much of this latter work was undertaken in conjunction with Marcel Grossmann, the Swiss colleague who had attended the Polytechnic with Einstein in the late 1890s and whose family had aided him in acquiring his earlier position at the Bern Patent Office. In the spring of 1913, less than a year after taking up his position in Zurich, Einstein was visited in Switzerland by Max Planck and Walter Nernst, two of the foremost scientists of the age. Both worked in Berlin and had come to Zurich to convince Einstein to return to the land of his birth to take up a position at the University of Berlin. The post came with automatic membership of the Prussian Academy of Sciences, as well as his appointment as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. This would allow Einstein to concentrate on his research and build a team of researchers around him. It was an offer he couldn't refuse, and was made more attractive by the prospect of being close to his cousin Elsa, who lived in Germany and whom Einstein had begun corresponding with frequently since the spring of 1912. Thus, early in 1914, Albert made the move to the German capital. His first wife, Mileva, agreed to move at first with their two sons, but she was immediately unhappy in Berlin and sensed Albert was growing closer to his cousin, and soon decided to return to Zurich with their children. They remained separated until 1919, when they finally divorced, at which time Einstein married Elsa. By then, both she and Albert were in their 40s, and this second marriage of Einstein's did not result in any further children, though Albert became stepfather to Elsa's two daughters from her previous marriage. Einstein's arrival in Berlin was immediately interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War. For years, tensions had been building between the major European powers over issues as disparate as colonial rivalry in Africa, the vacuum left by the collapse of Ottoman power in the Balkans, and the naval race between Britain and Germany. These all coalesced in the summer of 1914 into the outbreak of a pan-European war, which soon became a worldwide conflict. When it erupted, and Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium as a means of striking quickly at northeastern France drew widespread international condemnation, a document entitled Manifesto of the 93 and addressed to the civilized world was soon being circulated in Germany. The move was led by figures like Adolf von Baeyer, the 1905 recipient of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and Paul Ehrlich, the 1908 recipient of the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his pioneering work in chemotherapy, and was effectively a letter from dozens of prominent German academics sounding their support for Germany's war effort. Einstein, who was a lifelong pacifist, refused to sign it, and instead, with several other German academics, drew up the Manifesto to the Europeans, This expressed the idea that Europe's sense of common culture could be harnessed to bring the war to a swift end. Unfortunately, their hopes were not met, and the war was to drag on for 4 more years of interminable conflict, followed by years more of revolution and civil war across much of the continent. Despite the ongoing war, Einstein was able to commence new research in a concerted manner in Berlin from 1915 onwards as the initial shock of the outbreak of the war lessened. However, it was not until 1917 that the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was finally established in Berlin with Einstein as its first director. Funding and administrative delays wrought by the war effort had delayed its inception. He would serve as head of the institute for the next 16 years. Meanwhile, in 1916, he was admitted as a member of the German Physical Society, which had been established in 1845 and is the world's oldest major academic body of physicists. Foreign honors would also follow in the years ahead, including membership of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1920 and admittance as a foreign member in 1921 to the Royal Society, arguably the world's most prestigious scientific society and one which dated back to 1660 when it was founded in London. Such honors aside, Einstein continued to break new ground in his research in the mid-1910s. For instance, in 1916, he hypothesized the existence of gravitational waves, which are effectively ripples in the curvature of space-time. These could not be detected using the instrumentation available in the early 20th century. But in 2016, a century after Einstein predicted their existence, they were finally confirmed by American scientists. He was also beginning to theorize the existence of what we now know to be black holes, points in space where gravity is so strong that neither light nor particles can effectively escape from them and which distort space and time. As with so much else, his work on black holes was pioneering and paved the way for many of his successors to produce detailed accounts of the building blocks of the universe later in the 20th century. He could, however, be mistaken too. In 1917, he began working on what he termed the cosmological constant, a theory which supposed the existence of a static universe. Many years later, when the American astronomer Edwin Hubble discovered the recession of nebulae in the universe, Einstein realized his earlier theory of the cosmological constant was incorrect and referred to it as his, quote, biggest blunder throughout his career. His other great research project of the war years, though, was far from a blunder. Einstein had been working on the concept of relativity for over a decade, and special relativity was the subject of one of his acclaimed papers of 1905. Yet it was not until the mid-1910s that he began finalizing his research on the subject of general relativity. The general theory of relativity outlined the geometric theory of gravitation. This moved far beyond Newtonian ideas concerning gravity to explain gravitational pull and the full complexity of geometric gravity as it applies to the universe and not just individual planets. There is an ongoing debate as to who actually arrived at the general theory of relativity first, as his contemporary, the German mathematician David Hilbert, essentially arrived at nearly identical conclusions as Einstein did in the mid-1910s. As with Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who both broadly developed the theory of natural selection at the same time in the mid-19th century, both Einstein and Hilbert were in communication with each other, and Einstein had visited the University of Göttingen, where Hilbert was working in 1915, to present lectures on his own findings. What seems relatively clear is that Einstein and Hilbert influenced each other sufficiently that they both arrived at the same conclusions concerning general relativity within days of each other in the winter of 1915. In late 1918, Europe and the wider world began to emerge from the grip of the First World War, although in some countries such as Russia, Hungary, Turkey, and Ireland, the end of the war saw the commencement of bitter civil wars which eclipsed anything that those countries had seen during the war itself. Yet, with the resumption of some form of normal life, academic discourse resumed fully, and research began to be disseminated widely again. Thus, Einstein and Hilbert's work on the general theory of relativity reached a wider audience within the community of Europe and America's physicists. As it did, there was an increasing appreciation of how groundbreaking their studies were. Then, in the summer of 1919, the theory was confirmed as being accurate by Sir Arthur Eddington, an English astronomer and mathematician, during a solar eclipse. This time, the popular newspapers picked up the story, proclaiming that Einstein's theory had overthrown the model of the universe developed by Isaac Newton nearly 250 years earlier. Given all of this, it is perhaps unsurprising that in 1921, the Nobel Foundation in Stockholm decided to award Einstein the Nobel Prize for Physics. They specifically cited his work in discovering the photoelectric effect in his paper from 1905 in the award designation, but it could just as easily have been awarded for a wide range of research findings over the previous 15 or so years. Receipt of the Nobel Prize in 1921 and the opening up of the world during the boom time years of the 1920s after years of war and social discord saw Einstein and Elsa, whom he had just recently married, decide to travel internationally. In early April 1921, they sailed into New York City, where the couple were greeted by the mayor, John Francis Hylan, and a delegation of some of the most senior members of the city's Jewish community. Weeks of lectures and receptions followed, notably at Columbia University in New York and Princeton University in New Jersey. Later that month, Einstein met President Warren Harding in the White House. Afterwards, they left for a Pacific voyage to the Empire of Japan, and then onwards to Singapore and India before reaching the Middle East. There, Einstein visited Palestine, which had become subject to a British mandate following the end of the First World War, and where the Jewish Zionist movement was attempting to establish a new state for the world's Jews after centuries of being scattered around the globe. Afterwards, he returned to Germany. But the 1921 to 1922 trip was the beginning of a pattern of significant trips to different parts of the world. For instance, in 1925 he visited South America, spending weeks in Argentina, Uruguay and Brazil, countries which were booming economically and socially in the early 20th century and where Einstein was revered within the academic community. In the mid-1920s, Einstein became involved in a scientific debate which was widely reported on at the time. This was between himself and Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922, 12 months after Einstein had been awarded the same honor. A dispute had been building between Einstein and Bohr throughout the mid-1920s over their differing interpretations of quantum theory. Much of this centered on Bohr's refusal to believe that photons, which Einstein had first theorized the existence of in 1905, were real. He did not accept that they did exist until 1925, and even then, their debates raged on over other elements of their respective views on quantum mechanics. Debates were held in London and elsewhere between 1922 and 1925, but culminated in a famous academic disputation in 1927 at the 5th Solvay Conference at the International Solvay Institutes of Physics and Chemistry in Brussels. Here, Bohr and Einstein continued their debate, with both figures arguing points which eventually proved to be accurate. However, beyond the theoretical arguments, the conference is noteworthy for the number of the world's most accomplished physicists it drew together. 17 of the 29 attendees had already or later received Nobel Prize awards, while Einstein and Bohr were joined by figures including Marie Curie, Werner Heisenberg, and Erwin Schrödinger. It points to the sheer level of brilliance of the scientific community in the interwar period. The late 1920s also saw Einstein reconceptualizing his own theories of the universe. This was in response to the discovery by the American astronomer Edwin Hubble of the recession of the nebulae, or what is now termed Hubble's law. This states that galaxies are moving away from Earth at speeds which are proportionate to the distance they are from the Milky Way. These speeds are always faster, meaning that the further a cosmic body is from the Earth, the faster it will move away from the Earth. These findings, which were made public in 1929, required Einstein to abandon his current theory of the universe at that time, which was known as the cosmological constant, which supposed that the universe was largely static in the way that it expanded, that is, that the cosmos had been expanding since the Big Bang at a relatively constant speed. Hubble's discoveries forced Einstein to re-evaluate his hypothesis, as it was now clear that the universe was expanding at an ever greater speed. Hubble's discovery was also partly responsible for Einstein's decision to embark on a new journey to the United States in December 1930. He wanted to meet Hubble and thank him for his research, which he duly did in 1931. However, the trip is generally more remembered for Einstein's visit to California, where the ostensible purpose of the voyage was to take up a 2-month visiting fellowship at the California Institute of Technology, better known as Caltech today. During this sojourn, Einstein ominously noted that science had as much and perhaps a greater capacity to do harm than to do good within human society, a reference no doubt to the increasing use of technology in warfare, an issue the pacifist Einstein found abhorrent. This same aversion to the growing militarism of the 1930s led Einstein to have an affinity with the novelist Upton Sinclair and the actor Charlie Chaplin, both of whom he met in Los Angeles during his visit, and who were both publicly affirmed pacifists themselves. Einstein's growing friendship with Chaplin led him to attend the premiere of his new film, City Lights, a silent film which was significant in establishing the romantic comedy genre in American movies. When Albert and Elsa Einstein entered the cinema with Chaplin, Einstein was cheered with the same regard a Hollywood icon could obtain. It was also the beginnings of a long friendship with Chaplin, which saw the actor visit Einstein's Berlin apartment shortly afterwards, and Einstein renewed their acquaintance when he himself returned again to America early in 1933. While Einstein had been holding his positions in Germany and traveling widely in the 1920s and early 1930s, as his fame and accomplishments increased, the political environment back in his native Germany was changing for the worse. Germany had been mired in political chaos in the aftermath of the First World War, but from 1923 onwards had entered into a period of pronounced prosperity and instability. That was shattered late in 1929, when the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City crashed and a massive economic depression set in across the developed world. In Germany, as millions lost their jobs and their economic security, a huge proportion of the population turned in national elections to the rabidly anti-Semitic National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, under their leader Adolf Hitler. In Reichstag elections in 1932, they became the largest political party in Germany, and in the first months of 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of the country. Within weeks, the party effectively turned Germany into a one-party fascist state. This was extremely ominous for the country's Jewish population and individuals like Einstein. In the United States, he decided not to return to Germany, and instead the Einsteins settled in America after a brief visit to Antwerp in Belgium, where Albert handed his German passport into the German embassy and renounced his citizenship. In Berlin, the Nazis had already searched his apartment twice on account of his Jewish heritage, and over the next year or so, Jewish academics such as himself were forced out of their positions across Germany. In the United States, following his decision to seek permanent residence there in 1933, Einstein quickly acquired a position at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University in New Jersey. It was the institution which he would spend the longest portion of his career at, and, barring a directorship at Brandeis University in Massachusetts in the mid-1940s, Einstein was primarily associated with Princeton for the remainder of his life. In the mid to late 1930s, Einstein undertook some further notable work here on the East Coast of America. A particularly significant engagement resulted from collaboration with Nathan Rosen, a Jewish-American physicist. Together, Einstein and Rosen produced a model of what a wormhole might look like. Wormholes are theoretical structures which might connect disparate points in space-time together. At the time that Einstein and Rosen produced their theoretical wormhole bridge, they were a relatively novel concept, but they have latterly come to form a fundamental aspect of theoretical writings on space travel. In due course, they became a mainstay of science fiction writing from the middle of the 20th century onwards. While Einstein was teaching in the United States in the 1930s, developments were occurring back in his homeland of Germany, which would soon have global implications. Following their initial rise to power in 1933, the Nazis had made clear their intent to overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end. In the mid-1930s, they began rearming Germany, recruiting hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the military and building thousands of tanks, fighter planes and bombers. Then, beginning in the spring of 1938, the Nazis used diplomatic coercion to annex Austria into a Greater Germany and to seize territory from its other neighbors such as Czechoslovakia and Lithuania. When Hitler then invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France determined that they could no longer appease the Nazis and declared war on Germany. In the immediate term, the government of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not have public support for American involvement in what was deemed within the US to be a European war which it should not involve itself in. However, when Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, attacked the US Pacific Fleet at rest in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in December 1941, the United States also entered the Second World War. More than any war in human history, it was one which would be shaped by scientific innovation. Despite his pacifism, Einstein was soon involved in correspondence with the US government concerning the growing conflict. Indeed, this had commenced weeks before the war erupted in Europe. Early in 1939, European physicists had discovered nuclear fission using uranium. With this discovery, the theoretical possibility of developing a nuclear bomb of some kind moved ever closer. A number of European physicists, foremost amongst which was the Hungarian Leo Szilard, realized exactly how possible it now was that a dedicated research team could develop a nuclear warhead. This deeply worried many European scientists, as many of the continent's leading physicists worked in Germany and could be co-opted into helping the Nazis develop a nuclear weapon, one which Hitler and his accomplices would have little compunctions about using as a conventional weapon of war, despite its absolutely cataclysmic capacity for the loss of human life. Consequently, Szilard and two fellow Hungarian physicists, Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner, composed a letter to the US government warning of the risks of the Nazis developing a nuclear weapon before any other state. They sent this to America, where Einstein appended his signature to it before it was sent to the administration of President Roosevelt. What has become known as the Einstein-Szilard letter was influential in the months that followed in the US initiating its own program to develop a nuclear weapon. The Manhattan Project, the US government's program to develop a nuclear weapon, was initiated on a piecemeal basis late in 1939, just weeks after the receipt of the Einstein-Szilard letter. This ran enormously against Einstein's own pacifist inclinations, though the possibility of the Nazis acquiring such a weapon before the US had forced him into warning the government of the dangers of this occurring. This aside, he viewed war of any kind as a disease which should be resisted by all of civil society in the modern world. Accordingly, he did not play a role in the Manhattan Project itself. Rather, it was led by Robert Oppenheimer, an American theoretical physicist. Though its activities were limited between 1939 and 1941, once the United States entered the war in December 1941, funding and resources increased enormously, particularly so as it became increasingly apparent that the Nazis were, in fact, trying to develop superweapons such as a nuclear bomb at various installations in Europe, notably in Norway, where what is known as heavy water was being produced, a form of hydrogen with different nuclear properties which could conceivably be used to manufacture a nuclear weapon. The research here, though, was slow and was scuppered on numerous occasions by sabotage missions launched by British Special Forces and Free Norwegian fighters. By that time, the Manhattan Project was employing upwards of 130,000 people in the United States, and a nuclear reactor had been demonstrated in Chicago as early as 1942. Eventually, in mid-July 1945, the world's first nuclear device was detonated in the desert of New Mexico. By the time the first nuclear weapon was detonated, the Second World War had already been over in Europe for several weeks. However, because of the agreed Allied policy of leaving the conclusion of the war in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan until after Nazi Germany had been defeated, the conflict was still raging there by the summer of 1945. Accordingly, the administration of President Harry Truman quickly decided to use the new weapon against Japan in the belief that doing so would ultimately save over 1 million lives if it forced Japan to surrender quickly. Thus, on the 6th of August 1945, the first nuclear weapon used in warfare was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, killing upwards of 75,000 people on the first day, and a further 60,000 or so in the months that followed from radiation sickness. 3 days later, a second nuclear device of a slightly different kind was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, killing upwards of 80,000 people across the initial destruction zone, and as a result of the after effects. Japan did quickly surrender, but Einstein was appalled by the ferocity of the attacks and the fallout from them. Shortly after the bombings, he declared that the time has come now when man must give up war. It is no longer rational to solve international problems by resorting to war. He subsequently expressed his regret that his research on the molecular structure of the world and the concept of mass energy and equivalence, which he had first published in 1905, had contributed towards the development of nuclear weapons. The post-war years saw Einstein continue to research and publish, though by then he was nearing his 70s and the pressures of his public profile and some health concerns restricted how much he could accomplish. Nevertheless, at Princeton in the late 1940s, he developed what he referred to as his unified field theory, findings which he published in Scientific American in 1950 as On the Generalized Theory of Gravitation. This unified field theory sought to develop a single, unified theoretical framework which could be used to understand the fundamental forces of nature and the universe. Efforts had been undertaken by many physicists throughout the first half of the 20th century to develop such a unified theory, but none had met with acceptance across the academic community. Einstein's theory attempted to incorporate elements of his work on general relativity, electromagnetism, and gravity, and proposed a single origin for the entire set of physical laws, one which could unify forces such as gravitation, electromagnetic forces, and even the curvature of space-time with which much of Einstein's work in the 1930s had been concerned. Ultimately, his work and that of others in developing such a unified theory were unsuccessful, but his research in this respect is nevertheless regarded as being consequential in the further development of differential geometry, the study of the geometry of smooth shapes and surfaces, particularly as they apply to space. The years following the end of the Second World War in America also saw Einstein acquire a form of celebrity within mainstream society which was largely unprecedented for a theoretical physicist. In many ways, this went back all the way to the early 1920s and Einstein's first arrival in New York City. His theory of relativity had just been confirmed by other scientists, changing our fundamental understanding of the universe, while Einstein was the recipient of the Nobel Prize. The New York Times had run a story in December 1919 proclaiming that Einstein had, quote, destroyed space and time through his research findings. Here was the most fundamental overhaul of human thought since Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection a half a century earlier. But Einstein's work was greeted with applause, whereas Darwin's had been viewed as sacrilegious. His associations with figures like Charlie Chaplin in Hollywood and his increasingly iconic physical appearance all made him a more identifiable figure in the years that followed. Most tellingly, by the 1940s, it was becoming apparent how Einstein's revolutionary ideas were changing society and the world in practical ways, not just from the perspective of theoretical physics. As all of this occurred, he became a figure as fated within American society as Stephen Hawking later would be in the second half of the 20th century, or figures like James Lovelock and Richard Dawkins in the early 21st century. By the time his working life came to an end, Einstein's written and published output was enormous. Though it may seem unusual to many, Einstein's primary academic output was in the shape of papers in academic journals, of which there were nearly 300 over a span of 55 years, rather than books. This was and remains the primary means of communicating research for academics working in the hard sciences. Such books as Einstein authored, of which there were over a dozen, were generally reproductions of work he had already published as academic papers, the idea being to tie together his existing work on general relativity and other topics, or to try to make the material more accessible to a general audience. Some of these were used as advanced undergraduate and postgraduate textbooks for students of theoretical physics for years to come in universities. Additionally, translations were made into multiple languages, ensuring that Einstein's work was accessible in dozens of countries by the middle of the 20th century. Beyond this academic output, Einstein was a voracious correspondent, and at the Albert Einstein Archives at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, there are over 3,500 pages of his private correspondence dating from 1912 to 1955. He also wrote widely on various political, philosophical, religious, and humanitarian issues. Unsurprisingly, collected editions of Einstein's work, correspondence, and other writings, such as those published since the late 1980s by the Academic Press of Princeton University, the university where Albert spent nearly all of his career in the United States, have stretched into dozens of lengthy volumes. The individual who produced this enormous body of work was, despite his brilliance and celebrity, a resoundingly modest individual. He once proclaimed of himself, quote, "I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious." He never acquired the trappings of wealth or fame, and indeed visitors to his home in Berlin in the 1920s or America in the post-1933 period were generally struck by the modesty of the abode, where the most lavish adornment was usually a piano so that Einstein could play the classical music he loved. His family life, it must be admitted, was difficult. His two biological sons went to live with their mother after she and Albert separated in 1914, and thereafter their relationship was somewhat distant. Hans later immigrated to the United States in 1938, where they reconnected. But Edward remained in Europe and, despite maintaining a correspondence with his father, never saw him again after Albert left for America in the early 1930s. Edward later developed psychiatric problems and was institutionalized in Zurich. Albert's marriage to Elsa was also strained long before her death in New Jersey in 1936, and it has been widely speculated that Einstein retreated into his scientific inquiries at times as a substitute for his own weaknesses when it came to emotional relationships. Politically, he was humane, holding a lifelong aversion to violence and war. He deeply admired Mahatma Gandhi and his non-violent opposition to British rule in India, and the two became correspondents. Over time, his political views moved towards a criticism of capitalism and advocacy of socialism, while he also wrote on numerous occasions about the desire for a system of global government and an end to competition between nation-states. He held positive views of the United States, deeming the country to be a meritocracy, but the FBI had developed a dossier on him before he ever fully relocated to America from Europe, and by the mid-1950s it ran to over 1,400 pages, a not wholly unusual development for a former German and an academic in post-war America. An intrinsic part of Einstein's character was his Jewish heritage, though he himself was a professed agnostic and viewed the Bible as a collection of primitive legends. His Jewish heritage also shaped his life from the 1930s onwards, as it saw him relocate to the United States in the face of the Nazi threat. Einstein also became noted in his later years for his support for Zionism and the State of Israel. He had visited Palestine back in the 1920s when it was being governed as a British mandate in the aftermath of the First World War, At that time, hundreds of thousands of Jews were already living in or migrating to the region with the goal of reforming a Jewish state after nearly 2,000 years of being dispersed around the world. In 1925, Einstein agreed to be listed amongst the first Board of Governors of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem when it was established that year. Then, in the aftermath of the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of Europe's Jews who had survived the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis during the Second World War headed for the Holy Land. When the British mandate there expired in March 1948, the Jewish people declared a new state of Israel for the Jewish people in the Levant. In 1952, Einstein was offered the ceremonial position of president of the country, though he declined on account of his age and inability to leave the United States at that stage. Einstein remained supportive of the Zionist movement until his death, but one wonders what the pacifist in him would have made of the Israeli state as it descended into interminable warfare with its Muslim neighbors from the Suez Crisis of 1956 onwards. By the time Israel entered into the Suez Crisis or the Second Arab-Israeli War against its southern neighbor Egypt in 1956, Einstein had died. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, he had begun to suffer from an abdominal aortic aneurysm, an enlargement of the abdominal aorta, the largest artery in the abdomen. It can become blocked, much like any other part of the circulatory system, owing to high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and smoking. Einstein had the issue operated on successfully in 1948 by reinforcing the aorta wall, but despite improving his lifestyle, including adopting a vegetarian diet, the problem resurfaced again early in 1955 when the aorta ruptured, causing internal bleeding. He was admitted to hospital on the 17th of April, but refused emergency surgery to try to intervene to stop the bleeding, proclaiming philosophically that it was best to meet death with dignity when one's time had come. He died the following day on the 18th of April 1955 at 76 years of age. The surgeon who carried out his autopsy afterwards removed Einstein's brain for scientific study, though this was done without the permission of his family. It was subsequently dissected, and the remains of it are today found in the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C., while some sections were put on display in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia in 2013. It has been suggested that the abnormal number of glial cells in his brain might account for Einstein's inordinate aptitude for mathematical equations. His body was cremated shortly after his death in New Jersey, and his ashes were modestly scattered at an undisclosed location. Albert Einstein was one of the most influential thinkers in the history of science. So significant were his findings in his research over a span of half a century that his surname has become synonymous with elevated intelligence. Perhaps what is most unusual about this is that it all sprang from relatively humble beginnings. In the 1890s, he was effectively an international nomad when he was still a teenager and young man, moving between his native Germany, Italy, and Switzerland as his parents tried to balance their financial and business situation with their awareness of their son's precocious abilities as a mathematician and physicist. His time at the Polytechnic School in Zurich provided some stability, but Central Europe's universities saw fit not to hire him when he completed his initial studies there, and instead he spent several years working in the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. It was here, while evaluating inventions during the day and starting a young family, that he began working on some of the most significant research in the field of physics ever undertaken. The result, in the Annus Mirabilis of 1905, were 4 groundbreaking studies which revolutionized humanity's understanding of the nature of the universe, at once revealing the existence of photons and the nuclear and atomic building blocks of existence. 1905 changed everything. In the years that followed, Einstein was promoted year on year to ever more significant academic positions, until he eventually reached the peak of European academia in Berlin, just as the First World War broke out. In the midst of that calamitous conflict, he developed the general theory of relativity. In 1921, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work, though more accolades followed in the decades ahead. What is perhaps most notable about Einstein's career, however, from the 1920s onwards, is the public profile he developed. Visits to the United States, South America, across Europe, and the Middle East allowed him to advocate on behalf of a number of causes. The most significant was his ringing of the alarm bells about the threat posed by Nazi Germany from 1933 onwards. Indeed, he immediately renounced his German citizenship when Hitler seized power and moved to the United States. There, he continued to note the dangers posed by the possibility of the Nazis acquiring a nuclear weapon. However, it was a double-edged sword for Einstein, the pacifist, for the cost of seeing Nazi Germany defeated in the nuclear race was seeing the US drop its own atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. In the aftermath of the war, he used his position to advocate on behalf of a state for the Jewish people in the Middle East following the Holocaust. When he died in 1955, he was the most acclaimed scientist in the world, one who ultimately influenced the entire fields of physics, mathematics, and cosmology in the modern era. The history of the 20th century might well have been significantly different had it not been for Einstein. What do you think of Albert Einstein? Was he the most revolutionary intellectual in modern history, and what might explain his inordinate intellect? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Nikola Tesla was born on the 10th of July 1856 in Smiljanlika, which was originally part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire but is now located in Croatia. His father was Milutin Tesla, a priest of the Serbian Orthodox Church and the son of Nikola Tesla's grandfather, who was also named Nikola. His grandfather had served as a military officer for the French Empire during the Napoleonic Wars and had risen to the rank of sergeant before marrying Tesla's grandmother, Anna Kalinic, the daughter of a respected colonel. Following the defeat of Napoleon, Nikola Tesla returned to Lika, which was assimilated into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where he fathered two sons, including Milutin and his brother Josef, as well as three daughters named Stanka, Janja, and another whose name is unknown. Milutin Tesla and his brother were sent to the Austrian Military Officers Training Academy to follow the career path of their father, and while Josef thrived, eventually becoming a professor of mathematics at a military academy in Austria, where he authored several standard mathematical textbooks, Milutin decided instead to choose a devotional path, enrolling in the Orthodox seminary in Plaski to train as a priest after being castigated in training for not maintaining the shininess of his brass buttons. Nikola Tesla's mother was Duca Mandic, the daughter of a priest from Gračac called Nikola Mandic, and the sister to three very successful brothers, including Nikolai, who climbed the ecclesiastical ranks to become the Archbishop of Sarajevo and the Metropolitan of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Bosnia, Pajo, who became a colonel in the general staff of the Austrian army, and finally Trifun, who excelled in the business sphere as a respected hotelier and landowner. In addition to being a dedicated housewife, Duca Mandic possessed a keen intellect and a strong work ethic, and was herself an innovator of her household appliances, which she often modified to make more efficient. She was an inventor of the first order, according to Tesla, and a creative influence on him until her death in 1892. Milutin Tesla was a gifted student and graduated with top honors in 1845, marrying the 25-year-old Duca Mandic in 1847, after being delegated to oversee the parish of Senj on the Adriatic coast. Settling into a house perched on top of a cliff overlooking the ocean, the newlyweds started a family, with Duca giving birth to their eldest son Dane in 1848, a firstborn daughter Angelina in 1850, and finally another daughter Milka in 1852. However, due to the poor pay he received and the salty sea air which caused him health problems, Milutin Tesla was reassigned to the Church of St. Apostles Peter and Paul in Smiljan, which meant the place of sweet basil, in Lika province, where he was provided with a picturesque farmhouse, a parcel of fertile land, and even an Arabian horse, so that he could ride to see his parishioners. It was given to him by a Turkish pasha based in Bosnia as a reward for assisting some local Muslims. As well as being an extremely smart man who assembled a vast library packed full of volumes on religion, mathematics, science, and literary works in many different tongues, Milutin Tesla was also an arduous reformer of the Serbian people, regularly writing articles for a variety of newspapers and tirelessly promoting the establishment of language schools where Serbians could learn to read and write. According to his family, Nikola Tesla was born at midnight, sometime between the 9th and 10th of July 1856, in the middle of a terrific thunderstorm. 3 days later, Nikola was baptized at his family home, and with his future seemingly already planned, he was also enlisted as a member of the 1st Lika Regiment of the 9th Medak Company, a squadron he was to join when he was 15 years old by law. By all accounts, Tesla's childhood was happy and one he shared with his older siblings as well as his younger sister Marica, born in 1859, who would often accompany him to the churchyard or the farmyard to play with the chickens, geese, sheep, and other livestock which his father kept. Tesla was often joined by his black cat, Machak, who first introduced him to the phenomenon that would define his life's work after he set off a loud spark upon stroking him, an event which was explained by his father as a secretion of electricity. In another formative experience, again involving Machak, Tesla noted one day how a halo of light suddenly surrounded his dear cat, illuminating briefly the candlelit room he was sitting in. Inspired by such marvels, Tesla devoted much of his energy as a child to experimenting, and encouraged by his mother's inventive streak, drew up plans for flying machines, very similar to how a helicopter would later function. He disassembled clocks to see how they worked, and even designed himself a wooden sword so he could pretend to be a valiant Serbian warrior. Behind the fascination, however, lay a troubled young mind, as Tesla revealed that, as a young boy, he suffered from a strange affliction whereby he couldn't distinguish images from reality, which troubled him greatly. Tesla's childhood trauma was exacerbated by the death of his older brother Dane in 1863, who was killed in front of Tesla by the family's Arabian horse in a traumatic experience that would endlessly haunt him, and which was also the reason why his distraught father moved his family from the idyllic Croatian countryside to the larger town of Gospić, an unfamiliar environment where Tesla struggled to adjust to urban living. The untimely passing of Dane cast a long shadow over Tesla's own relationship with his father, who, mired in grief, always underappreciated the talents of his youngest son, a neglect that young Nikola tried to compensate for by striving to be perfect in everything he did so that he could win back the love of his parents. Blinded by sorrow, Milutin Tesla treated his young son with contempt, flying into rages when he caught him reading from his private library, and on one particularly hurtful occasion, after Nikola had accidentally ruined a local noblewoman's dress by unintentionally jumping on it as it trailed down the aisle of a church, he slapped his son across the face in public as a punishment. As a result of his strained relations, Tesla developed a series of peculiar phobias as a child, such as a repulsion for women who wore earrings and pearls, a strong aversion to hair, a loathing for the smell of camphor, as well as a number of other strange habits, including an obsession with counting his steps and measuring in volume the contents of his meals, calculations he was only satisfied with if they were divisible by 3. Overwhelmed by a plethora of odd neuroses, Tesla was able to regain some sense of balance after he came across a novel called Abafi, published in 1836 by Hungarian author Miklos Josika. which featured the story of Oliver Abbafi, a young, impulsive nobleman and hedonist, recast as a valiant national hero who sacrifices himself for the well-being of the country. Tesla was particularly inspired by the character of the protagonist, seeing in his desire to better his moral character while ignoring frivolous distractions a masterful example of self-restraint, which showed Tesla that it was indeed possible for him to control his wild emotions. Tesla realized that a good coping strategy was to work with, rather than against, the nebulous visions that assaulted his consciousness. And, delving even deeper into the make-believe world of his imagining, Tesla began to embark on strange journeys where he would stumble across fantastical countries, people and cities that he dreamed up. As Tesla honed that untamed imagination that would later serve him so well in his profession, he began theorizing about the nature of reality itself, coming to the conclusion that he could trace all of his mental images back to something he either saw, smelt, or touched in an early echo of the mechanistic view of the world he would later espouse. It was also an idea that had real-life application for Tesla, who, on one occasion, was extolled as a hero by a band of firemen after he spotted a small kink in a fire hose he instinctively knew was preventing water from reaching a burning building, a problem he quickly fixed by ironing the groove out. Tesla's ingenuity would be further fostered at the Realgymnasium, the grammar school he attended in Gospic, where he would amaze his mathematics professors by demonstrating a natural ability to calculate numbers. But while he excelled in scientific pursuits, Tesla was unable to translate his talents to drawing class, where a preference for undisturbed contemplation distracted Tesla heavily, leading to grades that were so extremely poor his father had to speak with the principal, which instilled in a young Nikola a lifelong aversion to diagrams. During his schooling at the Realgymnasium, Tesla began to take inventions seriously, devising the schematics for a flying machine that would use the pressure of a vacuum to push air molecules, a concept that a grown-up Tesla would later go on to disprove. Shortly after he graduated from the Realgymnasium in 1870, Tesla, perhaps because of his overactive imagination, became very sick with a range of maladies sufficiently serious enough for the doctors treating him to nearly give up on his case entirely. Throughout his recuperation, Tesla began voraciously reading, and it was during this period that he was first introduced to the tales of Mark Twain. It was a story he would later recount to Mark Twain himself, who burst into tears upon hearing it. After a period of convalescence, Nikola Tesla was next enrolled at the Higher Real Gymnasium in Karlovac in 1873, where, in accordance with his father's wish for Tesla to continue the family profession, he was enlisted in classes at the local seminary. However, Tesla's true desire was to learn everything he could about electricity, a passion ignited by an inspirational physics teacher who taught him about the radiometer invented by British scientist William Crookes, a device that powered a vacuum bulb with energy produced by 4 rapidly spinning tinfoil vanes. This roused Tesla to conduct some of his first experiments with batteries, induction coils, and electrostatic generators. Yet Tesla would have to put some of his projects on hold after again falling seriously ill with cholera upon his return home to Gospic, causing the young prodigy to be bedridden for over 9 months and to experience several close shaves with death. After one particularly worrying incident, Tesla supposedly implored his father that if he were to study engineering instead of entering the priesthood, that he may well recover, causing Milutin, desperate to avoid the unbearable pain of losing another son, to solemnly promise that Nikola would go to the best technical institution in the world. Having finally been heard, Tesla made a miraculous recovery, but before he could become a student, he was sent to the Croatian mountains with nothing but a bundle of books and some hunting equipment by his father, who, worried for his son's health, did everything in his power to hide his son from the authorities, as by law, Tesla would have to serve in the Austrian armed forces for 3 years. For 9 months, starting in the early fall of 1874, Tesla wandered the forests and lakes of the Eastern European countryside, becoming stronger physically and mentally as he thought deeply about invention, reshaping the vividness of his visions from a debilitating weakness into a powerful contemplative tool that could be used to flesh out the contraptions that flashed across his mind, such as a pipe installed underwater that could transport letters and packages placed in capsules using the principles of hydraulic pressure, and a ring constructed around the Earth's equator that could be used as a high-tech transport network. When Tesla returned, his father had kept his promise, securing for him a scholarship at the Military Frontier Administration Authority that would enable him to study for 3 years at the Polytechnic School in Graz, Austria. Receiving an embroidered bag made from typical Serbian materials from his mother, which he would always prize, in 1875 Tesla left Gospić to start anew in a completely different culture and environment, in the same way that his own Serbian relatives had adapted to life on the Austro-Hungarian border decades prior. During his freshman year, Tesla proved himself to be a perfect student, never once missing a lecture and supposedly studying from 3 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day, a schedule that was thought so extreme that one professor wrote to Milutin warning him that unless his son was escorted out of the school, that he might work himself to death, while others commended him for his zeal, such as the dean of the technical faculty who informed Milutin Tesla that his son was, quote, a star of first rank. In fact, Tesla was keeping himself very busy, administering his earliest experiments with alternating current, or AC, that would later make his name. But during his sophomore year, Tesla would be sidetracked, developing a destructive gambling habit and wagering away his entire tuition fund in the process. Near destitute, Tesla had also neglected his studies, scoring extremely poorly in the examinations, and with no marks registered for his final semester, he was also unable to graduate and was forced to abandon the university in December 1878, a failure he made sure to keep secret from his family as well as his classmates, as he was riddled with guilt and embarrassment. In 1879, Tesla would live for a while in self-imposed exile, first making his way to the city of Maribor, where he became a draftsman and was paid 60 florins a month, while in his free time he continued to play cards and wager money on the streets with the locals. Yet Tesla's Slovenian sojourn would be short-lived, as a couple of months into his stay, he was seized by the authorities for not possessing a proper residency permit and returned to Gospić escorted by armed police. Back home, Tesla's father would not get much time to set his son straight, as only a month later, on the 17th of April 1879, Milutin died, heartbroken that his son had been labelled as a vagrant and had chosen to indulge in a life of vice. Not content to see their talented nephew waste his abilities, in January 1880, 2 of Tesla's uncles gave him enough money to start courses at the Charles Ferdinand University in Prague, despite Tesla not meeting the language requirement, which specified that students had to be fluent in both Czech and Greek. However, communication issues aside, he also arrived too late and was unable to enroll in classes. And so, for the entire time, Tesla was only permitted to attend lectures and received no formal grades. In 1881, Nikola Tesla landed his first job for a telecommunications firm in Budapest called the American Telephone Company, where he was drafted in as an electrical engineer by Tivador Puskás, who had previously worked alongside Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, at the Edison Laboratories in Menlo Park. Making himself a valuable employee and sharing his findings with his work colleague Anital Sigeti, Tesla continued his study of the concept of the alternate current in his spare time, proposing that a motor driven by circuits that were out of phase could maintain power levels to supply a constant stream of electricity. But in order to make the system function, Tesla realized he needed to figure out how to rotate magnetic fields. Strolling in the park with Anatole Szigeti in February 1882, Tesla had a sudden stroke of genius and solved the rotating magnetic field problem, going on to explain the concept of the induction motor to his friend by drawing its basic blueprints in the sand with a stick, outlining a new type of engine that, unlike its direct current or DC counterpart, did not need a commutator, an inefficient cylindrical device segmented with metal that had to be regularly maintained. Impressed by Tesla's genius, Tivador Puskás recommended that Tesla move to Paris to work for his old acquaintance Thomas Edison at his Continental Edison Company, a firm that specialized in electrical equipment, where he was first assigned by his boss Charles Batchelor, a manager who had worked for Edison since 1870 with designing dynamos, a contraption that converted mechanical energy into electrical energy and which was used most commonly in direct current circuits. Off the clock, however, Tesla continued to advance the AC theory after he was sent to work on a project in Strasbourg, where he built the first induction motor prototype. However, Tesla was unable to garner any serious interest in alternating currents. This was unfortunate, as alternating current is recognized today as a better method of electric current delivery than direct current. Direct current, of the kind which came to dominate electricity delivery systems in the late 19th century, consistently sends electricity in one direction along an electric grid. Alternating current, by way of contrast, periodically reverses and changes direction along a grid or system as its magnitude alternately reverses course. Alternating current is considerably more efficient than direct current. Tesla's error, if it can be defined as such, is that he was simply ahead of his time in trying to propose alternating current as the better method of energy generation. He was correct, but the technology available at the time simply favored the more crude direct current method. Tesla soon found himself in another personal finance crisis after spending all of his wages, yet he had done enough during his stint at the company to impress his overseer Charles Batchelor, who was convinced that Tesla had the intellectual fortitude to work alongside Thomas Edison himself. In 1884, after being mistakenly registered as a migrant from Sweden after the immigration officer misheard him saying Smiljan, Nikola Tesla arrived in America armed with an introductory letter penned by his mentor Charles Batchelor, who stated, quote, "I know two great men. One is you, Thomas Edison, and the other is this young man." Although Tesla fundamentally disagreed with the notion of direct current, he was put to work improving the DC motors devised by Edison, who believed that the AC devices that Tesla envisioned were too dangerous and unfeasible, a diversion of opinion that would become a lifelong rivalry. Forced to develop an invention he had no belief in, Tesla became disillusioned and began outlining the weaknesses of DC and championing the advantages of AC, pointing out the inefficiency of Edison's direct current, which only dimly lit lamps, and proposing instead that generators should be engineered with what he termed the polyphase principle, whereby energy would be constantly recycled, since he believed in the cyclical nature of electricity. Tesla also insisted that a huge disadvantage of the direct current was its reliance on costly power stations installed at 2-mile intervals, since it was unable to maintain high levels of voltage over distance, in contrast arguing that the alternating current, in which the direction of energy was changed 50 to 60 times per second, was a lot more effective, since it could flexibly sustain varying levels of high voltage power and minimize power loss over long distances. This is why today, the power delivered to consumers via power grids is AC, which sustains power over long distances using transformer substations. These reduce the AC voltage over a given distance. Once the AC power reaches its destination, such as a home, the AC power is used directly for electrical appliances such as washing machines, but for other smaller appliances, it is possible to convert AC power to DC via diodes within the appliance's power supply. These only allow the electrical current to flow in one direction, thus ensuring the appliance receives a constant stream of power. Disassociating himself from Edison and eager to spread the AC gospel, Tesla started his own company in 1885 called the Tesla Electric Light Company with the financial backing of two rich benefactors, Robert Lane and Benjamin Vail, who were certain that the alternating current was the future. However, in a common issue that would prevent almost all of his later endeavors from succeeding, Tesla asked for too much money from his patrons, who, increasingly fearful that AC was too risky, ejected Tesla from his own company that same year, forcing him to eke out a living for the majority of 1885 as a repairman and even as a manual laborer, a job in which he was paid just $2 a day to dig ditches. Having learned from his mistakes, in 1886, with the aid of philanthropists Alfred S. Brown, a Western Union superintendent, and Charles F. Peck, Tesla established another company, this time called the Tesla Electric Company, based in Manhattan, New York, where he finalized the designs of the polyphase induction motor, unveiling it to the amazement of the scientific community in 1888, when he presented a landmark paper to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers entitled A New System of Alternating Current Motors and Transformers. George Westinghouse, an investor most famous for inventing the railway air brake and head of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, was particularly impressed, and his curiosity was piqued in a visit to Tesla's lab a few days later, where he was shown an early polyphase prototype. Convinced that Tesla's groundbreaking invention could power America, Westinghouse purchased all 40 of Tesla's trailblazing patents pertaining to the generators, motors, and transformers necessary to construct a polyphase alternating current circuit, and recruited Tesla as an advisor to serve for 12 months at the Westinghouse plant in Philadelphia, where some of the first commercially available AC devices would be produced. The release of the first AC machine in 1886 was the harbinger of a bitter conflict that erupted between Westinghouse and Edison, known as the War of the Currents, which pitted AC against DC from 1888 to 1892. During the dispute, Edison would try to use his resources to sway public opinion in his favor, and despite the evidence clearly showing that AC was safe and more effective over long distances, he issued a number of articles in the biggest publications warning of the dangers of the alternating current. Edison was unable, however, to convince his largest benefactor of the superiority of DC, and Wall Street wolf John Pierpont Morgan, who in 1892 merged Edison General Electric with the AC-focused Thomas Houston Company, removed Edison's name to create General Electric and switched entirely to alternating current instruments. With Edison sidelined, the alternating current emerged as the undisputed victor of the War of the Currents, as Westinghouse increased his annual turnover from $800,000 in 1887 to $4.2 million in 1890, while Tesla was paid around $105,000 in royalties by the end of 1891, a period that also witnessed several other personal and professional triumphs for Tesla, who officially became a U.S. citizen in July 1891, at the same time as he established two personal laboratories in New York, situated at South Fifth Avenue and East Houston Street. On the other hand, Tesla's dividend checks would come to an abrupt end after Westinghouse's finances were left in disarray, their plans to expand the company by borrowing heavily falling through in November 1890 after the collapse of the Baring Brothers brokerage firm compelled panicked creditors to call in their loans. To cover his losses, Tesla continued to focus his attention on high-frequency AC experiments, inventing a lamp that required only one wire, an oscillating transformer, and a high-frequency alternator, which he exhibited at a lecture in spring 1891 at Columbia College in New York on behalf of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers to a flabbergasted crowd who were amazed at the ways that AC could be implemented into modern lighting circuits. The Columbia lecture established him as the leading electricity researcher of his day, and in follow-up experiments, Tesla would consistently show that electricity for light and power could be transmitted over long distances. Before long, Tesla was also sketching out the fundamentals of radio technology. In an 1893 lecture at the Franklin Institute, later popularized by Century magazine, illustrating the concept of telegraphy without wires, he first underlined the importance of grounding the transmitter and receiver to astonished onlookers. The same year, Tesla's company achieved its greatest accomplishment to date after lighting up the Chicago venue hosting the world's Columbian Exposition entirely with alternating current, an honor that Tesla procured after outbidding General Electric by $1 million. By 1894, Tesla had gained the admiration of his peers and was awarded honorary doctoral degrees from Columbia and Yale universities, as well as the Elliott Crescent Medal by the Franklin Institute. More good news followed after the Tesla Electric Company was contracted to build the first ever hydroelectric power plant at Niagara Falls, a childhood dream of Tesla's that became a reality in 1895 after the first schematics were unveiled. The Niagara facility was an accomplishment that represented the ultimate defeat of the direct energy school of thought, and Tesla was lavished with the highest praise and honors, including even the Order of Danilo from King Nicholas of Montenegro, as his achievement was celebrated worldwide as an important step for the future of humanity. Tesla remained unperturbed after a fire in March 1895 at his laboratory destroyed much of his early research, including hundreds of models, notes, scientific tools, and photographs that had a combined value of $50,000. Despite this, in 1896, he demonstrated some of the earliest uses of the X-ray, discovered around the same time by the German scientist Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, and astonished his contemporaries with the first ever X-ray of a man, published in the Electrical Review, printed using rudimentary X-ray tubes of his own design. Having revealed some of the most innovative functions of the X-ray, Tesla next devised the basic elements of the radio transmitter, and in 1896 built a rudimentary unit that received radio waves. He assessed his new invention at the Gerlach Hotel, located on 27th Street in Manhattan where he was living, by sending radio waves to it from his New York laboratory on South Fifth Avenue. Tesla presented his insights at an 1898 exhibition at Madison Square Gardens, where he demonstrated a radio-controlled boat he called a tell-automaton to stunned audiences, and by 1901 he had been awarded with a patent clarifying that he had created a system for transmitting electrical energy. Between 1899 and 1900, after being commissioned by John Jacob Astor to assemble a new lighting system in a contract worth $100,000, Tesla relocated his laboratory at Colorado Springs, where, disobeying his patron's instructions completely, he decided instead to explore terrestrial stationary waves, which he regarded as his greatest discovery. At this rural outpost, located far away from the humdrum of New York City, Tesla started to piece together an enormous transmitter powered by millions of volts of electricity at an experimental facility built on the outskirts of the town of Nob Hill, keeping inquisitive onlookers away with an ominous Dante line nailed to the front entrance which read, quote, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." It was here that Tesla first discovered that the Earth had electric potential and could be employed as a finely tuned conductor to transfer electrical energy without wires, while next noticing that when his experimental Tesla coil was powered, it emitted sparks as far as 30 feet that could be detected by antenna 10 miles away. Realizing that he could now wirelessly transmit signals using the electromagnetic frequencies of the planet, Tesla explored the practical applications, managing to light up 200 lamps fed by a power source situated 26 miles away. Exploiting the same phenomena, he was even able to produce man-made lightning as a result. Tesla noted that the discovery of stationary electromagnetic waves and how they interacted with the Earth had far-reaching implications. It was a discovery which Tesla would spend the majority of the rest of his career investigating, as he felt it had the potential to transmit electrical power across large distances without the need for wires. Indeed, he hoped that his work could one day provide the whole world with clean and free electrical power. However, as with so many of Tesla's ideas, it was funded by investors such as J.P. Morgan, who intended to market his inventions for profit and were only prepared to fund research which would garner a return on their investments. Thus, it would be the all-powerful market forces that would eventually scupper so many of Tesla's imaginings. It was during this fertile period of discovery that Tesla also made some more unorthodox assertions, claiming that he had made contact with extraterrestrial beings that had triggered a series of ominous beeps that sounded from one of his receivers. Tesla had first heard this strange combination of noise from the device in the middle of the night and interpreted the regularity of the beeps as a sign that they were being manipulated by an intelligent entity, a theory he publicly advanced in a letter to the American Red Cross in January 1901. Although Tesla's story was discounted by many skeptics, there were still some who believed him. Influenced by the notion of an intergalactic race of Martians, first popularized in 1895 with the release of a book called Mars, penned by the American astronomer Percival Lowell, Tesla's supporters pointed out that he may have established contact with aliens from the Red Planet. Nevertheless, convinced of the revolutionary potential of terrestrial stationary waves, Tesla returned to New York in January 1900, eager to secure funding for a major invention that would eclipse his scientific rivals who were also investigating wireless systems such as Reginald Fassenden, Lee De Forest, and in particular Guglielmo Giovanni Mario Marconi, an Italian inventor who became Tesla's next arch-nemesis after Edison. Eager to keep his May 1899 promise, in which he vowed to wirelessly communicate with Paris by 1900, Tesla hunted for a source of funding after patenting the magnifying transmitter he had constructed at Colorado Springs. Since the device he envisioned had to generate enormous volumes of electricity from AC equipment, Tesla first approached his old ally George Westinghouse, who declined to become involved but loaned him the necessary machinery, while the majority of the project's funding came from the coffers of Wall Street whiz J.P. Morgan, who signed a deal with Tesla after negotiations discussing the purchase of Marconi's wireless patents broke down. After convincing him that the wireless transfer of information would make the expensive underwater cables his company used to send transatlantic messages obsolete, Morgan informed Tesla he was willing to support him with a $150,000 investment on the condition that he would own a 51% stake of the inventor's patents. Between 1901 and 1905, with the backing of the biggest financial titan in the world, Nikola Tesla constructed the 187-foot-high transmission tower at Wardenclyffe Laboratory, topped with a 68-foot copper dome, which was the first wireless broadcasting system ever built and was largely powered by a gigantic magnifying transmitter designed to channel large concentrations of electricity to any destination conceivable. Assured that by setting up receivers attached to the ground he could pick up the electromagnetic waves emitted by the tower anywhere, Tesla was desperate to overshadow his rival Marconi, who in December 1901, at St. John's in Newfoundland, was hailed as the inventor of wireless telegraphy by the world's press, after reporting triumphantly that he had successfully received the first transatlantic signal sent by colleagues at Poldhu in Cornwall, England. With the jaded Tesla making it explicitly clear in newspaper interviews that he believed Marconi had stolen many of his ideas from the 1890s and wishing to keep his benefactor on side, he next announced that he was going to create a world telegraphy system. a cutting-edge communication array similar to the World Wide Web of the 1990s, in which individual receivers would pick up messages and news broadcasted by transmitting facilities. Tesla pictured several different types of receiver, one that anticipated the fax machine by acting as a printer and publishing daily newspapers, one that was a loudspeaker that could play voice messages, and another that was a handheld contraption attached to a vertical wire on a short pole that could decode radio waves, foreshadowing the modern cell phone. By the summer of 1902, Tesla had moved permanently to Wardenclyffe Laboratory and was focusing exclusively on amping up the power levels. On the other hand, after setting up a company with Morgan to assist the enterprise, Tesla found it hard to sell shares to the moneyed New York elite, who believed the investment was too risky, an appraisal not shared by Tesla, who sold $33,000 of his personal property and borrowed a further $10,000 to realize his dream. Faced with an additional $30,000 bill from Westinghouse for the equipment, a lawsuit from the landlord James Warden, who was taking Tesla to court for not paying property tax, as well as another bill from the phone company who had installed a special line out of the laboratory, Tesla struggled financially. Tesla's promise to extend the coverage of his system so that it could be detected as far away as Australia failed to persuade Morgan, who in July 1903 let Tesla know that he was unwilling to invest any more capital, a mortal and unexpected blow to the world telegraphy system that enraged Tesla, who, in true mad scientist fashion, furiously cranked up the voltage of the magnifying transmitter at Wardenclyffe to the maximum level and hurled lightning bolts into the New York sky. From a risk perspective, Morgan's decision was quite understandable, since after 2.5 years, Tesla had failed to fulfill his pledge to provide a transatlantic system in 6 to 8 months, and a Pacific branch a year later. Yet others have postulated that Morgan abandoned Wardenclyffe because he was worried that Tesla was going to make the energy completely free for everyone, and thus deprive his firm of a lucrative paycheck, while another interpretation contests that Morgan was growing increasingly less confident in the wireless industry, which had been mired in scandal by the actions of Lancelot E. Pike. He was a conman who had stolen investor money after promising to create a wireless service between Philadelphia and New York. Moreover, Morgan felt more inclined to invest in DeForest Wireless Automobiles, a company founded by another of Tesla's rivals that was projected to make $5 million a year, and which had already secured for itself a major contract with the US Navy by February 1903, supplying wireless DeForest transmitters. After this, Tesla, no longer the darling of electrical engineering, continued to have no luck attracting investors as the breakdown of his Wardenclyffe project had turned academic and public opinion against him, with the once celebrated genius now painted as a man who could never quite fulfill his promises. Determined to restore his credibility to investors by putting out a commercial product, Tesla devised a scheme to sell small Tesla coils to laboratories around the country via a company called the Tesla Electric and Manufacturing Company, but this ultimately went under because of a lack of investment. Downtrodden and defamed in the US, Tesla would learn that even his reputation in his homeland could not save him after Serbian bankers declined to fund him, while his old business partner, John Jacob Astor, still annoyed that Tesla had spent his 1899 loan researching terrestrial stationary waves instead of wireless lighting, politely refused to get involved. By early 1904, Tesla was hiring out his services as a consultant and had embarked on a new project that aimed to harness the power of Niagara Falls in partnership with the businessman William B. Rankin. Yet Tesla's real desire was always to restart his experiments at Wardenclyffe, a prospect that was becoming increasingly unlikely since investors were discouraged by the fact that Morgan still owned 51% of Tesla's patents, meaning that business partners would always have to consult him to reap any financial benefit from Tesla's inventions. In response, Tesla bombarded Morgan with impassioned appeals to take him back on, in a series of letters that could come in many forms, with some carefully prepared proposals promising Morgan unrealistically high profit margins, while in others, Tesla desperately scribbled emotional outbursts decrying his unfair treatment. Unable to drum up financial backing and still struggling to get the Wardenclyffe Tower functioning, Tesla was in a dark place and began spiraling into a true nervous breakdown after the untimely death of his business associate Rankin and the collapse of Canadian Niagara Power in the fall of 1905. A man who was always fascinated with human psychology, in the 1920s Tesla shared his experience of emotional collapse with author George Sylvester Viereck in a well-publicized book on Freudian theory, explaining how, in his delirium, he was haunted by images of his deceased brother Danny, as well as their mother. Tesla would recover from his breakdown in 1906, and with a new determination to prove himself as a valuable asset, he switched his focus from electrical to mechanical engineering, delving into the science of flight in a bid to raise money so that he could continue his work at Wardenclyffe, which in 1904, due to lack of funds, he had mortgaged to George C. Bolt, the owner of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel where Tesla lived for many years. The result was the invention of a turbine that worked without blades. But Tesla's contraption was met less than enthusiastically by John James Astor, who refused to invest in the idea in 1909. Yet Tesla still remained highly confident in his design, issuing 2 patents for a pump and a turbine in October, and even starting a new company, the Tesla Propulsion Company. However, after Tesla again failed to impress at a demonstration at the Waterside Power Station in New York, and still daydreaming about restarting his research into wireless power, he approached the son of J.P. Morgan, Jack Morgan, in 1913 about him becoming a potential investor. More interested in his turbine designs, Jack Morgan allocated Tesla $20,000, who instead of using the money in the way it was intended, spent it all trying to persuade Sigmund Bergman, a German industrialist, to finance his project, which was discontinued after the outbreak of World War I. Over the next 10 years, as his personal wealth began to evaporate, Tesla continued to assess his turbine and to work in conjunction with manufacturers such as Pyle National in Chicago, Allis-Chalmers in Milwaukee, and the Budd Company in Philadelphia. But he was unable to fix a recurring problem that ultimately spelled the project's doom, as if operated at over 10,000 RPM, the thin discs of the internal machinery would start to deform, and there were no stronger materials available. Tesla's inability to secure funding for any of his pursuits and his penchant for overspending led to the near emptying of his bank accounts, and from 1916 he was forced to file for bankruptcy. Tesla admitted that his monthly income was no more than $350 to $400, after declaring he was unable to pay $935 in taxes to the New York Treasury, and although he was still technically the president and treasurer of the Nikola Tesla company, over 90% of the company's stock was owned by friends, bankers and creditors, and many of his patents by then had expired, leaving Tesla virtually penniless. In a bid to save himself from financial ruin, Tesla launched a lawsuit against Marconi in August 1915, accusing the Italian of illegally patenting radio technology in 1904. But the case went nowhere, and Marconi remained the official owner for the time being, with a decision later overturned by the Supreme Court in 1943, only a few months after Tesla's death. Consequently, Tesla was forced to earn a living by creating minor inventions and registering several improvements in automobile speedometers, frequency meters, and flow meters, which he licensed to Waltham Watch Company in 1918. The company used Tesla's name as a marketing ploy to sell scientifically built speedometers, as despite Tesla's changing circumstances, his name still carried a certain gravitas, and Tesla's opinions and thoughts still garnered much press interest, such as in 1917, when, presaging the advent of radar technology in the 1930s, he forecast that microwave radiation could be employed to detect ships. In the midst of his financial troubles, Tesla still had his admirers, and in 1915 it was reported by the New York Times that he had jointly won the Nobel Prize for Physics, an honor he was to share with his one-time ally and now bitter enemy Thomas Edison. But when it was presented at the awards ceremony, it was instead given to William H. Bragg and his son, as Tesla refused to share the award with his nemesis, nor had he forgiven the Institute for recognizing Marconi as the pioneer of radio communication technology after they had awarded him the same accolade in 1909. 2 years later, in 1917, however, Tesla's individual efforts would be recognized when he accepted the Edison Medal from the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, the most prestigious prize in electronic engineering, where his life's work was praised in an address by the vice president of the organization, who said, "Were we to seize and eliminate from our industrial world the result of Mr. Tesla's work, the wheels of industry would cease to turn, our electric cars and trains would stop, our towns would be dark, and our mills would be idle and dead." His name marks an epoch in the advance of electrical science. Yet Tesla cared very little for the decoration, opting to leave the Engineers Club where the awards ceremony was taking place shortly before he was presented with the medallion, forcing his friend and the person who had nominated him, B.A. Berendt, to embark on a frantic search that ended in Bryant Park, across from the venue where Tesla was busy feeding pigeons. Tesla particularly loathed the fact that the award was in his rival's name. Despite being lauded for his work in electricity, Nikola Tesla remained poor throughout the 1920s, and because he made only a small income from the royalties he received from licensing his minor inventions, he became embroiled in a string of legal disputes, such as in June 1925, when he was sued by the attorney Ralph J. Hawkins for failing to pay $913 in fees. It was during this decade that Tesla started to retreat from the public eye, living hotel to hotel as an eccentric recluse and spending so much of his time feeding the pigeons in Bryant Park behind the New York Public Library that one end of the park, Nikola Tesla Corner, now honors his name. However, on his 75th birthday in 1931, Nikola Tesla was suddenly back in the spotlight, appearing on the front cover of Time magazine, and thanks to the efforts of a young science writer called Kenneth Swayze, he received over 70 letters of congratulation published in a testimonial volume from some of the most esteemed scientists of the day, including Albert Einstein. Interviewed by Time magazine, Tesla outlined many of his future plans and confidently disclosed how he was going to disprove Einstein's theory of relativity, how he was unconvinced that energy was released from a split atom, as well as espousing the possibility of interplanetary communications in a conversation he enjoyed so much that every year thereafter, Tesla would organize a press conference on his birthday, usually a 6-hour affair where Tesla would speak to a number of reporters and update them about his scientific and personal progress. For example, in 1932, he informed the general public about his desire to build a motor propelled by cosmic rays, and in 1936 he told journalists that he wiggled his toes hundreds of times before he went to bed, an exercise he believed would tone his body and enable him to live until he was 135 years old. The 1934 party was a particular highlight, where Tesla first revealed he was in the process of creating a particle beam weapon, claiming in the New York Times that it could send concentrated beams of particles through the free air of such tremendous energy that they will bring down a fleet of 10,000 enemy airplanes at a distance of 250 miles from a defending nation's border and will cause armies of millions to drop dead in their tracks. Anticipating the later doctrine of mutually assured destruction and the concept of nuclear stalemate, Tesla believed his laser beam could end war completely, since it was so devastating that every conceivable defensive measure would be useless against it. Although Tesla was susceptible to flights of fancy on occasion, the death beam was a real project and was the subject of a Tesla study rediscovered in 1984 entitled The New Art of Projecting Concentrated Non-Dispersive Energy Through Natural Media, which laid out the fundamentals of a weapon system that discharged tungsten and mercury particles at 48 times the speed of sound to produce devastating projectiles. Despite Tesla's invention being impossible, it elicited a great deal of publicity, motivating Tesla to recruit Hungarian architect Titus de Bobula to design a new tower to evaluate the death beam. Yet the project would never get off the ground, as by 1935, Tesla was no longer working with de Bobula, who had proven himself a slippery character after attempting to borrow money from Tesla and trying to get him involved in an illegal arms deal in Paraguay. Nevertheless, Tesla, ever wily, was still able to use the furore that surrounded him to his advantage in some situations, offering up a working prototype of the laser beam valued at $10,000 to the managers of the Governor Clinton Hotel as compensation for the $400 that he owed them, while warning them that the box he gave them, supposedly containing the weapon, would explode if improperly handled, resulting in terrified staff depositing it at the back end of the hotel vault. The laser beam also came to the attention of the international community, and Tesla soon found himself entering negotiations with the League of Nations, the UK government, and even the Soviet Union, who signed a contract in April 1935 stipulating that Tesla was to supply them with the information necessary to construct the weapon, although it is unknown if Soviet scientists actually carried out the research. The project, however, would start to disintegrate from January 1938, after the British concluded negotiations with Tesla, while the final nail in the coffin would occur in 1940 after he was left empty-handed following a desperate attempt to persuade the US government that the laser beam could be a viable World War II weapon. Hampering Tesla in his last-ditch attempts to liaise with international governments was his declining health, which had started to deteriorate in 1937 after he was run over by a taxi and refused to get medical treatment for injuries that he would never recover from, subsisting on a meager diet of boiled vegetables and warm milk, and making sure to keep 3 feet away from everyone to avoid catching germs. Tesla's personal health choices led to no improvements, and by 1942 he was spending the majority of his days confined to his bed, where his grip on reality started to loosen. When in July, for example, Tesla tried to send money to Mark Twain, who had died in 1913, opting to see only a select few visitors, including the exiled Prince of Yugoslavia, Peter II, and a young scientist called Blois Fitzgerald, the creator of an anti-tank gun who would come to discuss inventions. Tesla isolated himself from the world as he deteriorated. Nikola Tesla died of a heart attack in his sleep on the 7th of January 1943 at his executive suite in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, where he had been living for the previous 10 years. Inundated with letters of condolence from major scientific and political figures all over the world, such as Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the US President, the Vice President Henry Wallace, and a host of Nobel laureates, Tesla's funeral took place at St. John the Divine Cathedral in New York City on the 12th of January, where it was attended by over 2,000 people and presided over by members of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Afterwards, Nikola Tesla, who by the end of his life boasted over 700 patents to his name, was cremated and his ashes were placed inside a golden sphere, which is still exhibited at the Tesla Museum in Belgrade. Following his death, the US government were curious as to whether among Tesla's surviving notes there could be information to help them in the war effort, and so they investigated his documents but found nothing of profound importance. And by 1951, they had been repatriated to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade and were accompanied a few years later in 1957 by Tesla's ashes. For decades after, though, the mystery surrounding the laser beam gun persisted, as the US government consistently denied they had in their possession one of Tesla's microfilms, which, according to official records, had been intensively reviewed for over a month, sometime after his death. The truth of these claims, however, remains unproven. Born to Serbian parents on the Austro-Hungarian borderlands, Nikola spent his early childhood in pastoral paradise, playing for hours in the farmyard and the churchyard with his siblings and his cat Maciek, who first set in motion Tesla's lifelong obsession after showing him the strange ways that electric phenomena interacted with the material world. As a youngster, Tesla was besieged by a catalogue of perplexing illnesses, including an oversensitivity to mental images which made the products of his imagination seem real, as well as a fixation with quantifying everything he saw and experienced. Tesla was a classic eccentric genius, possessing an irrepressible self-belief in his own ability to devise fresh and original concepts, which he presented with the flamboyance and performance flair of a showman. As on stage, he was equally as electric as his subject matter, coming across, in the words of New York World reporter Arthur Brisbane, as a most radiant creature with light flaming at every pore of his skin, from the tips of his fingers and from the end of every hair on his head. By the middle of the 1890s, Tesla was at the apex of his power and making major contributions to a number of other academic fields. But Tesla, who prioritized his intellectual pursuits and never took a wife or started a family, also had his fair share of anxieties, the pressure of his line of work making him particularly susceptible to emotional outbursts of despair and anger when things were not going his way. Tesla's misfortunes often arose because he was overly confident in his outlook, produced only a few tangible commercial results from his experiments, and had no qualms about irresponsibly spending all of his investors' money while still asking for more, a habit that would irreparably damage his reputation in his later years and transform him into an impoverished recluse who hid away in New York hotels. As he began to ail in the 1930s, Tesla enjoyed a renewed wave of international popularity when he revealed that he was planning to assemble a laser gun that he anticipated would be so powerful that it would end all conflict. Yet, like many of his schemes, it would never come to fruition, fizzling out by 1940 after his last effort to interest the US government failed. Although, many decades after, curiosity about the death ray would still persist. Following a period of mental and physical deterioration in 1942, Nikola Tesla died at his room at the Hotel New Yorker on the 7th of January 1943, but was immortalized for his foundational contributions to science. Today, one of the world's most prominent and valuable companies is called Tesla Inc. It is a company which seeks to revolutionize transport systems and how energy is delivered across the world. And while it has no direct connections to Nikola Tesla, the man, it is fitting that his life's work has been remembered in this way. Tesla, an ethnic Serb, hailed from Croatia in the mid-19th century, at a time when the Balkans was very far from the center of technological and industrial development, and formed part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a backwards power which did not contribute greatly to wider societal development at the time. And yet, despite these impediments, he made enormous breakthroughs during his lifetime in a wide range of different fields. It was Tesla who first pioneered alternating current, who made major advances in radio technology, and who first devised many of the systems which are used today in renewable energy systems. Perhaps most impressively, he devised the entire concept of wireless technology and communication. In this respect, he stands in a small line of individuals in modern history, which includes Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, Thomas Edison, and Albert Einstein, whose life's work have transformed our understanding of modern science and how society functions. Given all of this, we might ask why Tesla was not credited as much as he should have been in his own lifetime for his successes. The answer to this conundrum is relatively clear. Tesla's ideas and the systems he came up with were simply ahead of their time, and he was overshadowed by the innovations introduced into Western society by Thomas Edison, a similar genius whose designs around electricity were more suitable for the level of technological development which prevailed in Europe and North America in the second half of the 19th century. But while many of Edison's inventions and pioneering work around electricity generation are now viewed as being somewhat archaic and inefficient, Tesla's designs and ideas are still widely praised. Perhaps in this respect, it should be left to Edison to have the last word on Tesla. While he dismissed the Serb's idea of alternating current as being impractical at the time, in the end, Edison concluded that Tesla was one of the truly great figures in the development of our electric world. Edison was entirely correct in his assessment. While Edison won the contest to become the leading figure in electrification in North America at the end of the 19th century, when you boil a kettle or use many other electrical appliances today, you are most likely using an alternating current device rather than the direct current which Edison championed. As such, while Tesla lost the current war in the 19th century, he was a prophet of 20th and even 21st century technology and energy efficiency. Although Nikola Tesla did not invent, or rather discover, AC power, his genius lay in his ability to find far-reaching real-world applications to new discoveries and natural phenomena. He possessed a vision which few of his contemporaries could match, even Thomas Edison, and there is no doubt that he changed the world just as much as his former employer, as the light bulb would be next to useless without a reliable and safe means of power delivery over long distances. Indeed, there are few people whose work has impacted more on modern-day society than Nikola Tesla, with electric power now being available to the majority of the human race, largely thanks to his work. He even tried to work out a way in which power could be delivered freely to consumers, which perhaps both explains why he is today so highly regarded, but also why he never managed to monetize his work in the same manner as people like Edison. Perhaps what most endears us to people like Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and the breed of latter-day inventors and scientists who, with little or no formal education, revolutionized their respective fields, is the image of the eccentric mad scientist working alone on experiments and calculations. In an age in which the discoveries and achievements of individual scientists are today subsumed by the multinational corporations they work for, there is something romantic and inspiring about one human being having such a positive impact on human civilization through their own endeavor. Nikola Tesla is one of these people, and despite the fact that he did not perhaps receive the money or recognition he deserved in his lifetime, he has, since his death, been immortalized as one of the greatest and most important inventors to have ever lived. What do you think of Nikola Tesla? Do you believe he was a more brilliant scientist than Einstein? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Robert Oppenheimer was born on the 22nd of April 1904 as Julius Robert Oppenheimer in New York City. He quickly became known primarily by his middle name and is typically referred to today as Robert Oppenheimer or J. Robert Oppenheimer. Robert was born into an affluent Jewish family in New York City. His father, Julius, had been born in the Hesse-Nassau province in the territory of the Kingdom of Prussia, in what had just become the United German Empire, months prior to his birth, in May 1871. At a time of growing anti-Semitism across Western and Central Europe, Julius Oppenheimer left Germany in 1888 at 17 years of age, bound for the United States. Though virtually penniless, he prospered in America, and by the time Robert was born in 1904, he had risen to become a wealthy executive at one of Manhattan's leading textile manufacturers. Robert's mother was Ella Friedman, a woman of Jewish heritage as well, who had been born in New York in 1870 to a family of German Jews who had headed for America a generation before Julius Oppenheimer. She was a painter from whom Robert inherited some of his aesthetic views on the structure of existence and the universe. Ella and Julius would have one other child, a boy named Frank, who was born 8 years after Robert in 1912, and who would follow in the steps of his older brother by becoming a physicist. Robert's youth was a privileged one. By the mid-1900s, his father had become a substantial figure within New York business circles, and in the early 1910s, they moved into a large apartment on West 88th Street in Manhattan, overlooking the Central Park Reservoir in one of the most affluent areas of New York City at the time. There, the family had original works by Vincent van Gogh and Pablo Picasso, among others, on the walls. Robert attended the Ethical Culture School, followed by the Alcuin Preparatory School, two of New York's best educational establishments in the early 20th century. By the time he was 5, he was already interested in mineralogy, a hobby inherited from his German grandfather. Such was his aptitude that at 11 years of age, he was admitted to the Mineralogical Club of New York City. His precociousness extended into his secondary school years, and he finished his education at Alcuin in a year and a half less than the standard time, having taken 2 grade years in 12 months and being fast-tracked through the 8th grade. By this time, his interests had developed beyond mineralogy into the harder sciences, particularly chemistry. But it was eventually physics which would prove his calling in years to come. In 1922, Oppenheimer began studying at Harvard University at the age of 18. Robert initially intended to focus on studying chemistry, but soon switched to physics. Yet his earlier interest in chemistry and his eclectic inquisitiveness would serve him well in later years during a period when scientists were becoming all too specialized in specific fields. While studying at America's oldest college, he was deeply influenced by the teachings of Professor Percy Bridgman, an experimental physicist on the staff at Harvard at the time. This was also a period when students at Harvard and other elite universities in America still studied a very wide range of subjects, and Oppenheimer delved deeply into history and the Greek and Latin classics, which were still central to many Western curricula in the 1920s. Reflecting on his years at Harvard in later life, Oppenheimer noted that he spent most of his time in the library and read voraciously. He even attended more classes than it was necessary for him to. The result in 1925 was that Oppenheimer graduated with a Bachelor of Arts summa cum laude after just 3 years at Harvard, a distinction which usually took 4 years to attain, but which Oppenheimer, following an emerging pattern, completed in less than the standard time. Even before he graduated from Harvard, Oppenheimer had already been accepted to continue his studies at Cambridge University in England. This was the great center for the study of physics in Britain at the time, a reputation it has held and cultivated since Isaac Newton's days there in the late 17th century. The year that Oppenheimer spent at Cambridge between the fall of 1925 and the summer of 1926 was influential in his development, as he was exposed there to the teachings of Lord Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealand-born physicist who is typically understood to be the father of nuclear physics today. For instance, it was Rutherford who first discovered and explained what nuclear half-life and the radiation associated with it were, an achievement which Rutherford was awarded a Nobel Prize in chemistry for in 1908. Towards the end of his first year at Cambridge, Oppenheimer, whose abilities were beginning to attract considerable attention amongst European physicists, accepted an offer from the German physicist Max Born to study under him at the University of Göttingen in Germany, one of Europe's great centers of learning. There, Oppenheimer studied with a number of contemporaries who would become giants of the study of theoretical physics during the 20th century, notably Werner Heisenberg, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller, several of whom Oppenheimer would work alongside during the Manhattan Project in the midst of the Second World War. Remarkably, Oppenheimer was awarded his PhD in physics in the spring of 1927, less than a year after arriving in Göttingen. The internal examiner, James Franck, who had won the Nobel Prize for Physics 2 years earlier in 1925, is famously said to have expressed relief when the oral examination, or viva voce, concluded, stating that Oppenheimer had easily defended his doctoral work and had seemed to be ready to begin questioning Frank. The great promise which Oppenheimer showed as a theoretical physicist, as he acquired his PhD around the same time he turned 23, was most clearly demonstrated in a paper which he and Born co-authored on the quantum theory of molecules in 1927, and which laid out what has come to be known as the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. This pertains to the fields of molecular dynamics, or how molecules move and interact. The approximation which Born and Oppenheimer demonstrated showed that the wave functions of nuclei and electrons within a molecule are different, owing to the fact that nuclei are considerably heavier than the electrons. This means that the coordinates of the nuclei are relatively fixed in place, whereas the lighter electrons are impacted on to a greater extent by wave functions, and their coordinates are consequently more dynamic. The approximation was reached by the pair to a great extent owing to Oppenheimer's dual interests in chemistry and physics, as the theory which they presented employed elements of quantum chemistry and molecular physics. In terms of its practical applicability, the approximation was important in allowing scientists from the late 1920s onwards to separate the motion of a nuclei and an electron. The individual who worked this out with Max Born, and who acquired his PhD at Göttingen, was a curious figure. Oppenheimer was a mix of a distant scientist and a relatively jovial individual, slipping from introversion to extroversion as occasion sometimes demanded, or as his mood was inclined. A chain smoker, he was perennially surrounded by a cloud of smoke throughout his adult life, a habit which would contribute substantially to his premature death in his early 60s. Individuals who knew him during his years at Harvard, Cambridge, and Göttingen recalled a person who was a strange mix of intelligence combined with a striking naivety at times, often making poor judgments and decisions and being prone to exaggeration. As the years went by, he developed an arrogant streak, but this was tempered by intellectual generosity to those who studied and worked with him, and those he taught in later years. A striking aspect of his personality was his interest in Eastern philosophy and mysticism, being particularly interested in Hinduism and Confucianism, even going so far as to learn Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hinduism, so that he might read the ancient texts of this faith in the original. This interest in religion and mysticism was not an eccentric pastime. For Oppenheimer, the study of physics was an entry point into understanding the mystical nature of the universe and existence, and his broader intellectual outlook was one of open curiosity rather than a quest for hard scientific data. There was, though, also an unstable and erratic side to Oppenheimer. His behavior at Harvard was sometimes questioned by fellow students and teachers. In 1926, while he was at Cambridge, he allegedly doused an apple with some illness-inducing chemicals and left it in the office of his tutor, Patrick Blackett, with whom he had had a difficult relationship, before heading off to France on holiday. Evidently, this action, and perhaps others besides, saw him briefly threatened with being suspended from his studies at Cambridge. A close friend of his in the 1920s, Francis Ferguson, who later went on to become an acclaimed theorist of stage performance and drama, claimed that Oppenheimer attacked him and tried to strangle him once when he told him he was engaged to be married. Underlying all of this erratic behavior was a strange mix of an individual who could be appallingly arrogant and fell out with a great many colleagues over the years as a result, but who many biographers have concluded was also a deeply insecure individual. The root of this may have been Oppenheimer's position as the son of a German Jewish émigré to America at a time when anti-Semitism was common across the Western world. He was a constant outsider, or at least felt like one, and is known to have suffered frequently from bouts of depression. He was, in short, something of an enigma. After completing his studies at Göttingen and publishing several more papers from the research he had undertaken in England and Germany, Oppenheimer returned to the United States, briefly holding fellowships at Harvard and the California Institute of Technology, punctuated by return visits to Europe to work for a few months at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and at Zurich in Switzerland, where Albert Einstein had carried out much of his earliest and most groundbreaking work. In Leiden, he acquired his nickname Oppie, from a bowdlerized Dutch rendering of his name. It was not until 1929 that Oppenheimer settled back in America permanently, having been presented with numerous job offers from US universities. He accepted two and became an associate professor in physics at both the University of California at Berkeley and the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. For the next 13 years, between 1929 and 1942, he would hold positions at both institutions, teaching during the fall and winter semesters at Berkeley before spending the spring term lecturing at Caltech in Pasadena. During the 1930s, Oppenheimer became famous within the physics community in the United States for his teaching methods, and the finest physicists of the mid-20th century in America trained under him at Berkeley and Caltech, at the School of Theoretical Physics which he founded. Within this, there was usually a cohort of a dozen or so advanced graduate students and research fellows who worked closely with Oppenheimer on some of the most relevant questions in the field of theoretical physics at the time. During busier times in term, they would often meet daily, with Oppenheimer quizzing them on their progress and offering suggestions thereon. Mostly, as several biographers who knew him during these days later recounted, he inspired those he taught, conveying to them the idea that they were at the forefront of answering some of the most important questions facing humanity at the time. Yet it was an eclectic academic environment, and when not discussing physics, Oppenheimer and his colleagues were often seen to be reading Plato in the original Greek or learning Sanskrit. Hans Bethe, who knew Oppenheimer during these days, later recalled that Robert was largely aloof from the wider world in the late 1920s and 1930s in California, only learning of the Wall Street crash of late 1929 months after it had happened. There were impressive scientific breakthroughs made by Oppenheimer and his students at Berkeley and Caltech during the 1930s. In 1930, for instance, Oppenheimer wrote a paper which effectively predicted the existence of the positron, or anti-electron, as an antiparticle of the electron, although its existence was not fully proven until 1932 by Carl David Anderson, a student who worked with Oppenheimer at Caltech. Following on from this, Oppenheimer worked closely with Wendell Furry to work out the modern form of the electron-positron theory and how the two interacted with each other. Perhaps his most important work, though, was a giant effort with Melba Phillips, one of Oppenheimer's first doctoral students at a time when female physicists were all too rare in the United States. Together, they proposed the Oppenheimer-Phillips process in 1935, a type of deuteron-induced nuclear reaction in which the neutron half of a deuteron fuses with a target nucleus, ejecting a proton in the process. This proved that some elements can become radioactive if bombarded by deuterons, and that a nuclear interaction can occur at lower energies than had previously been understood. This and many other breakthroughs by both Oppenheimer and his students at Berkeley and Caltech made California one of the world's great centers of theoretical physics in the mid-20th century. Oppenheimer's personal life was somewhat chaotic during this period. He had been diagnosed with a mild case of tuberculosis in the late 1920s, for which condition he sought out the dry desert air of Arizona and New Mexico in the years that followed, eventually buying a ranch in New Mexico. In the mid-1930s, he began a relationship with Jean Tatlock, a psychiatry student who was the daughter of John Strong Tatlock, an eminent Old English scholar and expert on the life and works of Geoffrey Chaucer. 10 years Robert's junior, Jean was a troubled young woman with severe depression and a conflicted sexuality. Their relationship was tempestuous, but continued through to 1940, even after Oppenheimer began seeing Kitty Harrison, a botanist and physicist at Caltech, who eventually divorced her second husband, Stuart Harrison, in November 1940 and married Robert the following day. It remains unclear to this day if Oppenheimer continued to periodically see Tatlock in the early 1940s prior to her taking her own life in January 1944. Robert and Kitty would subsequently have 2 children, a boy named Peter, who was born in May 1941, as Kitty had been pregnant already when they married, and a daughter named Catherine after her mother, who was born in 1944. Oppenheimer's life, like that of virtually every individual across Europe, North Africa, North America, and much of Asia, was hugely interrupted in the autumn of 1939 by the outbreak of the Second World War. The conflict came about as a direct result of the ascent to power in Germany of the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler early in 1933. A rabidly anti-Semitic nationalist and fascist organization, the Nazis had made their twin goals to crush the Jewish people in Germany and to initiate a new war in Europe to overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, and to build a new German Third Reich or empire which would dominate the continent. Oppenheimer was very familiar with the Nazis. As a Jew himself, albeit a non-observant one, he had become politically involved for the first time in his life during the mid-1930s, when he began setting aside 3% of his salary to help German Jews who were trying to flee Germany in the wake of the anti-Jewish Nuremberg laws, which were introduced from 1934 onwards. The Nazis' anti-Jewish policies had become more extreme from 1936 onwards, and particularly so in 1938, as Germany began annexing neighboring states, firstly Austria and then Czechoslovakia. With the invasion of Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but public opinion in the United States was not yet wholly in favor of intervention in what was deemed to be a European war. Therefore, America would remain officially neutral for the first 2 years of the conflict, though the administration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was providing extensive support in the shape of war material to Britain from the war's inception. Oppenheimer's life and his place in history would be changed forever by the events of December 1941. By that time, the United States still remained neutral in the Second World War. Despite the desperate situation in Europe, with the Nazis conquering Poland in the autumn of 1939, Denmark and Norway the following spring, and then the Low Countries and France in the summer of 1940. With many other states like Italy, Hungary and Romania allied with the Nazis, and invasions of Britain's colonies in North Africa and Russia afoot from the summer of 1941 onwards, it seemed that Germany was destined to dominate Europe. It was in this context that the Empire of Japan, an ultra-nationalist state bent on creating an Asiatic and Pacific empire, one which already included Korea, Manchuria and much of eastern China by the early 1940s, decided to preemptively attack the United States without declaring war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and other American territories, such as the Philippines, on the 7th of December 1941, pulled the United States into the Second World War. Within days, the US was at war with Germany, Italy and the other Axis states as the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere ended up at war. Oppenheimer would soon be catapulted to the center of America's research efforts during the conflict. This occurred in the context of efforts by Nazi Germany to acquire a weapon of mass destruction as a means of winning the war swiftly. In the 1920s and the 1930s, Germany had been home to some of the world's leading scientists, and so was well placed to develop a nuclear weapon. Nuclear fission, for instance, had been discovered by a team led by Otto Robert Frisch and Lisa Meitner in Berlin in 1938. Various experiments were initiated by the Nazis the following year to begin using this breakthrough to develop a nuclear weapon. Some of these focused on developing a nuclear reactor, while others favored the theory of using heavy water to produce an atomic weapon, research which was carried out in Nazi-occupied Norway throughout the war. Already in August 1939, President Roosevelt in Washington, D.C., had received a letter from the Hungarian nuclear physicist Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein, alerting the US government to the threat posed by these Nazi experiments. Little effort was made to respond to this in 1939 or 1940, but with the entry of the US into the war at the end of 1941, fresh consideration was given to America commencing its own research in this area. Oppenheimer would technically be in charge of the Los Alamos laboratory during the Second World War, but this was all under the umbrella of the Manhattan Project, a research and development program initiated by the US government in 1942 with the ultimate aim of developing a nuclear bomb. The name comes simply from the fact that the team of individuals who were in charge of the wider project had their first headquarters where they met in 1942 on the island of Manhattan in New York City. Eventually, it grew from 1942 onwards to employ approximately 130,000 people across the country. They worked on various elements of the project in many states and regions. For instance, a large team working in Chicago throughout the war, which included Oppenheimer's old colleague from Göttingen, Enrico Fermi, and Leo Szilard, who had co-authored the letter to Roosevelt in 1939, warning the president about the Nazi nuclear program, developed the first working nuclear reactor there. Another team at the Hanford site in Washington state were charged with producing plutonium from uranium as a raw material for any future nuclear weapon, and a similar project was underway in Tennessee. There were even teams of individuals operating under the rubric of the Manhattan Project in Europe, carrying out espionage to try to uncover what the Nazis were working on. Oppenheimer would oversee the most critical research team of all those involved in the Manhattan Project as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. He was very nearly not picked for this position. The individual who oversaw the Manhattan Project was Major General Leslie Groves. Groves is not exactly a household name today, but he has the distinction of having been in charge of both the Manhattan Project, which created the first nuclear weapon, and also overseeing the construction of the Pentagon as the headquarters of the U.S. military and Department of Defense. Oppenheimer was suggested to Groves in 1942 as a possible candidate to lead a team of theoretical physicists and scientists as part of the Manhattan Project, but Groves was initially skeptical, favoring the idea of appointing someone who had been awarded a Nobel Prize in physics and would consequently have enough academic gravitas to lead a team of some of the most eminent minds of the day. He was eventually persuaded that Oppenheimer had a track record of getting the best out of people he worked with. He contacted Oppenheimer, and after interviewing him, came to the conclusion that he was well suited for the post. In the weeks that followed in the early winter of 1942, Oppenheimer scouted out a suitable location for the establishment of a research center, somewhere remote and away from any urban centers, where secrecy would be ensured and a nuclear weapon could be tested in due course. He eventually settled on Los Alamos in New Mexico, where a research facility was erected on the site of an old school. This was subcontracted to the University of California through the War Department, so that Oppenheimer had some degree of autonomy in hiring and firing as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory. Although there would be more hiring than firing, at its height there were well over 5,000 people employed at Los Alamos, far more than Oppenheimer had initially anticipated. The team that Oppenheimer assembled at Los Alamos included some of the finest scientists of the first half of the 20th century. One was John Hasbrouck van Vleck, a physicist and mathematician who had been at Harvard when Oppenheimer arrived there in 1922. He was subsequently awarded a Nobel Prize in 1977 for his work on electronic magnetism. Van Vleck made significant contributions to the gun design which would be used in the bomb used over Hiroshima. A colleague of Oppenheimer's from Berkeley, Robert Serber, acted as an organizing physicist at Los Alamos and would eventually name the bombs used in the first test explosion, as well as against Japan, as Thin Man, Little Boy, and Fat Man, after characters from detective movies and novels such as The Maltese Falcon. Hans Bethe was a German-born theoretical physicist who would later be awarded a Nobel Prize in 1967. He was central to calculating the critical mass of the bombs designed at Los Alamos. Finally, Edward Teller was a Hungarian-born Jew who was recruited to the Los Alamos Laboratory. He had studied in Germany around the same time as Oppenheimer in the late 1920s, but had subsequently immigrated to the United States. Teller had already worked at Fermi's Reactor Center in Chicago before being sent to New Mexico. Teller was arguably Oppenheimer's closest colleague at Los Alamos. Beyond these were hundreds of other engineers, metallurgists, chemists, and military experts involved in the research teams at Los Alamos, working on a wide range of finer details about how the first atomic weapon could be constructed. The task which confronted this team of physicists and other engineers and scientists was daunting. When they assembled at Los Alamos, they had little to work on other than a theoretical knowledge of how a nuclear chain reaction could be produced. But what must be remembered in an age when we know what a nuclear explosion looks like and the destruction that it results in, is that Oppenheimer and his colleagues at Los Alamos were not just trying to build a nuclear weapon, but also to predict what would happen when one exploded. Thus, there was an enormous amount of experimentation and theoretical speculation throughout 1943 and 1944. Throughout it all, Oppenheimer worked exhaustively. As Hans Bethe recollected years later, his uncanny speed in grasping the main points of any subject was a decisive factor. He could acquaint himself with the essential details of every part of the work. He did not direct from the head office. He was intellectually and even physically present at each decisive step. Yet the incredibly arduous work schedule which Oppenheimer followed at Los Alamos also took a toll on his health. He was always a thin person, but during the work in New Mexico, he lost another 20 pounds, eventually weighing as little as 110 pounds or less than 8 stone. During the course of 1943, research efforts at Los Alamos began to focus on a prototype codenamed Thin Man. This was a plutonium gun-type weapon, which would work more like an artillery gun to detonate rather than an implosion-type bomb. The research into producing this was extremely complex from a logistical perspective, with the polonium, which was used in the initiator, having to be obtained from ores in Ontario, in Canada, and then manufactured at a separate facility in Tennessee, which was also part of the wider Manhattan Project, or at the Hanford site in Washington state. However, more complex still was the design issue. In order for the gun-type weapon to work, a plutonium bullet which would be fired off inside the bomb would have to be accelerated to a speed of 3,000 feet per second, or over 3,200 kilometers per hour, or else the nuclear fission would begin before the rest of the mechanics of the bomb were ready for a successful explosion. This was ultimately the undoing of the Thin Man design, as it was realized during the course of 1944 that the gun barrel needed to produce this speed would be far too large to be employed in a bomb of a kind which could be transported on board a B-29 Flying Superfortress, the newly designed heavy bombers which were to be used to transport any nuclear bomb developed by the US government. This, along with issues relating to the use of plutonium in a gun-type bomb, saw the Thin Man design abandoned in April 1944. With the abandonment of the Thin Man design, Oppenheimer redeployed many of the scientists and engineers who had been working on it to another design called Little Boy. This was a simplified gun-type fission bomb, but unlike the Thin Man, it was intended that uranium-235 would be used instead of plutonium for the nuclear fission that would create the explosion. Simultaneously, a third type of design was being progressed. The Fat Man, as it was known, would use plutonium but was designed as an implosion-type bomb. The design team for it was led by an American physicist by the name of Seth Neddermeyer. Oppenheimer continued to favor the gun-type design even as the Fat Man was being furthered during the course of 1943 and 1944. Oppenheimer's brilliance as an overseer at Los Alamos was seen in his decision to bring John von Neumann, a Hungarian-born mathematician and physicist, to Los Alamos in 1943 to review the design. It was von Neumann who suggested a spherical shape and shaped charges which would reduce the amount of plutonium needed and make the assembly of an implosion-type bomb more practical and achievable. Over the next several months, metallurgists at Los Alamos had to try to solve the problem of how to cast plutonium into a sphere, but this was eventually overcome when a plutonium-gallium alloy was devised, one which was pressed into spheres and coated with nickel. The design process was nearing completion. As 1945 dawned at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer's teams were coming close to completing both the design of the Little Boy and Fat Man. Consequently, there were two plausible candidates for a successfully built nuclear weapon. In the end, both would be completed at roughly the same time, as design problems were worked out in the spring of 1945 and the required levels of enriched uranium and plutonium were produced in the sites in Washington state and Tennessee. The latter were enormous undertakings, given the technology available to the Manhattan Project, as it was extremely costly and time-consuming to enrich these to become fissile substances in the mid-1940s. Other elements which needed to be resolved were engineering problems for the most part. For instance, the Fat Man bomb was being assembled using a huge array of approximately 1,500 bolts in 1944, an impractical amount in order to develop a working bomb. By the time it was completed in the early summer of 1945, Oppenheimer's team had reduced this to just 90 bolts. Other technical issues concerned how the bomb would descend when dropped from a height, and throughout 1944 and 1945, tests were done to assess how a bomb of the size and structure of the Fat Man and Little Boy would fall through the air. All of this came together during the course of the spring of 1945, and by midsummer, Oppenheimer was able to deliver the head of the Manhattan Project, Major General Leslie Groves, the news that they were ready to conduct a test detonation. The Trinity nuclear test was carried out in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico on the 16th of July, 1945. Fittingly, the desert's name, translated from the Spanish, means Dead Man's Root. Oppenheimer revealed in correspondence with Groves in 1962 that he codenamed the test Trinity as he had been reading the religious poetry of the 17th century English poet John Donne around the time that he came up with the name. The device which would be used during the test was a Fat Man bomb, using plutonium and of an implosion type. For the purposes of the test, the bomb in question was christened the Gadget. In order for the test to be carried out safely, a location was chosen which was highly remote, almost entirely unpopulated and otherwise isolated. There was only one building on the proposed blast site, the McDonald Ranch House, which had been built there by a German migrant in 1913 and which had been forcefully vacated in 1942 by the McDonald family after the US government took over the region under the remit of the Manhattan Project. The test was a carefully planned thing, as the plutonium which was to be used had cost billions of dollars to produce in today's money. Such were the tortuous methods involved in enriching uranium and plutonium at the time. Much hinged on its success. As Groves noted at the time, he didn't want to explain to a congressional committee why he had blown up $1 billion worth of plutonium in the desert for no reason. The Trinity test was carried out near dawn on the morning of the 16th of July. Observation shelters were established in 3 different places to the north, south, and west of the blast site, each approximately 9 kilometers away from where the bomb would be detonated. Goggles were provided to prevent against harmful ultraviolet wavelengths, while the distance was considered safe enough in terms of the radioactive half-life which would be produced. Many of the observers that morning were scientists and included Oppenheimer, Teller, Bethe, Enrico Fermi, and John von Neumann. Some believed that the bomb would not work. Others were concerned about exactly how destructive it could prove to be. They had their answers at 5:29 a.m. when the Gadget exploded, releasing explosive energy equivalent to 25,000 tons of TNT. This created a crater 1/3 of a kilometer wide and melted the sand across the launch site, turning it into a light green glass-like rock. The observers, 9 kilometers away, did not hear the immense noise from the shockwave for 40 seconds after the detonation. But by that time, they were witnessing a growing fireball which changed color from purple, green and orange eventually to white. Then it coalesced into a mushroom cloud, one which eventually spiraled 12 kilometers into the sky. The shock from the explosion was felt nearly 100 kilometers away, while those at the observation shelters 9 kilometers away later recollected that there was a brief period of immense heat, like they were standing in front of an open oven for a few seconds momentarily, when the bomb detonated. Oppenheimer's supposed words as he watched the Trinity test explosion have become somewhat infamous in modern times. He is alleged to have quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the holiest texts in Hinduism, one which was written in the second half of the first millennium BC, and the title of which approximates to the Song by God. The Gita is a 700-verse scripture, which primarily revolves around Prince Arjuna and his guide, the Hindu deity Krishna, on a wide range of moral and religious matters. It is widely and mistakenly believed that Oppenheimer quoted a line from the Gita in which another Hindu god Vishnu says, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Although the line would have been a fitting utterance that morning in New Mexico, in reality, Oppenheimer never said this. Instead, recalling the event 20 years later, he said that another line from the Gita ran through his head, one in which it is stated, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One." On reflection, in 1965, he thought the other line would have been more fitting, but despite the myth that has developed, Oppenheimer never actually uttered the words, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." However, for what in retrospect should have been a sobering moment, the general reaction in the observation shelters was one of glee that the Manhattan Project had succeeded. Oppenheimer, it was later noted, was jubilant. The ramifications of their success, though, would become all too clear within a matter of weeks. Within weeks of the Trinity test explosion, the atomic bomb would be used as a weapon of war. By that time, the conflict in Europe had come to an end, as the Allies had streamed into Germany from both east and west in the spring of 1945, leading to Hitler taking his own life in Berlin in late April, and the Nazis surrendering just over a week later. However, the Empire of Japan had indicated no willingness to surrender, and Japanese honor systems and military culture seemed to suggest an invasion of the Japanese islands would be necessary to bring the war in the Pacific to an end. The US government had calculated that this could result in millions of deaths as the Japanese would fight to the bitter end. Consequently, the decision was quickly taken to utilize the new atomic bomb as a demonstration to the Japanese government of the new weapon which was available to the administration, which was now headed by President Harry Truman, who had succeeded to the White House following President Roosevelt's death in office in mid-April 1945. The result was the bombing of the Japanese city of Hiroshima, with one of the little boy bombs on the 6th of August 1945. In Los Alamos that evening, Oppenheimer was triumphant and seemed to regret the fact that the weapon had not been available to use against the Nazis in Germany. However, this mood quickly gave way to disillusionment 3 days later, when the US dropped a second bomb of the Fat Man type on the city of Nagasaki in Japan. Surely Oppenheimer and his colleagues concluded this was not acceptable. After all, the Japanese had not been given enough time to process the implications of the first bomb and to decide to surrender, which they did 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki. With that, the war came to an end. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only 2 occasions in world history when nuclear weapons have been utilized in warfare. They are accordingly enormously controversial. Today, most analysts of the events of August 1945 tend to take the same view as Oppenheimer and his colleagues did, that the use of the first bomb in Hiroshima was somewhat justifiable, though imminently regrettable at the same time, as a means of forcing the Japanese to surrender and in the process potentially saving millions of lives by avoiding a land invasion of the Japanese archipelago. But most are agreed that the bombing of Nagasaki just 3 days later was unwarranted. More broadly, the ethical implications of the work Oppenheimer and his colleagues carried out as part of the Manhattan Project during the war have been questioned. There are 2 sides to this. On the one hand, the development of nuclear weapons has introduced an existential threat to humanity's survival in modern times. But on the other hand, the nuclear deterrent has ensured that the world's superpowers and large states have avoided major wars ever since 1945. For centuries, Europe's states had been endlessly at war with one another. That all changed once it became apparent that direct conflict could result in mutually assured destruction. Ironically, the impact of the development of nuclear weapons has been to foster a nuclear peace, but the risks remain profound in a world where politics are becoming more antagonistic and destabilized during the 21st century. With the end of the war, Oppenheimer's reputation was at an unprecedented height within American academic circles. There were accordingly new opportunities open to him, and he decided to leave Berkeley and head to the East Coast to take up a position as director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton in New Jersey in 1947, an esteemed center for the study of physics in the United States, which included Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, and Paul Dirac as former charter members or visiting fellows. Under Oppenheimer's leadership, it became a center for emerging physicists, and when he left Berkeley, a half a dozen of his more promising graduate students left also to study at Princeton. In New Jersey, he continued the methods he had developed in California in the 1930s, producing an environment of energetic discussion and research, often at the expense of his own research. Oppenheimer choosing to write and publish very little himself at Princeton. As a result, the institute became the leading center for the study of physics in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many of the most important physicists of the second half of the 20th century passed through the institute, notably Yoshiro Nambu, a Japanese-American who in 2008 would be co-awarded the Nobel Prize for his role in discovering the spontaneous broken symmetry in subatomic physics, and Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize in 1969 for his work on elementary particles. As well as his work at Princeton, Oppenheimer continued to hold a number of government positions throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, while also having security clearance to view classified documents and material relating to the United States' evolving nuclear program. Notable in this respect was his membership of the newly established Atomic Energy Commission, which had been founded in 1947 as a commission headed by the United Nations, itself a newly created body designed to foster world peace in the aftermath of the war. The Energy Commission was charged with regulating the proliferation of nuclear materials and the development of nuclear weaponry. While the United States was for several years the only nation with access to nuclear bombs after 1945, it was only a matter of time, now that the world had seen that it was possible to develop such weapons, before other nation-states began building their own bombs or trying to develop them. Oppenheimer and several of his former colleagues from the Manhattan Project were central to efforts in 1946 and 1947 to establish restrictions on nuclear proliferation, which are still in force today. As the first chairman of the commission, Oppenheimer tried to discourage a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union in the context of the developing Cold War, but these efforts were in vain, and a major nuclear arms race developed once the Soviets conducted their first successful test of a nuclear weapon in 1949. As news of the Soviet acquirement of a nuclear weapon reached the US in 1949, debate began within the government of President Harry Truman about the development of a hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb, a far more powerful nuclear weapon than the atomic bombs which had been developed under the rubric of the Manhattan Project and used against Japan in 1945. Oppenheimer and a great many other scientists who had contributed to the work at the Los Alamos laboratory between 1942 and 1945 were opposed to such a measure, arguing that such a weapon could not be used in any practical sense in warfare, without causing immense damage and potentially triggering a nuclear war, which would wipe out much of life on the planet. In their petition to the government in late 1949, they stated that the extreme danger to mankind inherent in the proposal to develop thermonuclear weapons wholly outweighs any military advantage. Nevertheless, Truman pressed ahead and greenlit the new program in January 1950. Nearly 3 years later, in November 1952, the first hydrogen bomb was tested on an atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Ivy Mike, as the bomb was named, produced an explosion equivalent to over 10 million tons of TNT and was 450 times more powerful than the atomic bomb which the US dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. Despite the reservations expressed by Oppenheimer and many others, the Cold War was heading into the era of mutually assured destruction. As much as he had been absolutely central to the Manhattan Project and a senior government scientist for many years, Oppenheimer fell foul of the government in the early 1950s during the Second Red Scare. These were years when the Cold War with the Soviet Union was deepening, following the division of Germany into a Western-aligned West Germany and a communist East Germany. along with the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Warsaw Pact as a rival military alliance, while the Korean War pitted the Western and Communist blocs against each other for the first time in a major proxy war. In this environment, America became racked with what were initially legitimate concerns about communist organizations within the United States, acting as a fifth column for the Soviet Union within America. But this soon gave way to intense and unfounded paranoia about the motives of anyone associated with socialist politics, or even groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union. The Second Red Scare, which is termed as such to distinguish it from the First Red Scare, which struck America in the late 1910s following the Russian Revolution of 1917, gathered pace from the late 1940s and was at its most intense between 1950 and 1954, as Senator Joseph McCarthy undertook extensive efforts to identify and bring to trial anyone even remotely suspected of communist sympathies. Oppenheimer would soon come under suspicion during the Second Red Scare. Oppenheimer's associations with socialist and left-wing political movements and civil liberties organizations in America stretched back to the mid-1930s, when, after being largely apolitical throughout his youth, he began to finally take an interest in political affairs. This led him to join a number of left-wing and progressive movements at a time when socialist parties and organizations were seen as the logical opposition to the growing fascist tide across Europe, particularly so from 1936 onwards, when the Soviet Union and other communist parties supported the Republicans against the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. It should be noted, however, that Oppenheimer never actually joined the Communist Party of the United States, though a great many individuals who were very close to him were active members, including Jean Tatlock, with whom he was involved romantically from 1936 onwards, his wife Kitty, and his brother Frank. Other movements which Robert was involved in, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, were also considered radical between the 1930s and 1950s, but are now viewed as the torchbearers of the civil rights movement which ended segregation after nearly a century. All of this ensured that Oppenheimer was viewed with some suspicion by the authorities, a development which was compounded by his father's birth in Germany once the United States entered the Second World War, though this was a complete oxymoron, as Oppenheimer's Jewish background would have made him a persona non grata to the Nazi regime in Berlin. Nevertheless, suspicions abounded about Oppenheimer. He was even under surveillance throughout America's involvement in the Second World War, a bizarre period during which he was one of the most senior figures involved in the Manhattan Project. But the FBI simultaneously had a file open on him. These issues coalesced by 1949, and that year Oppenheimer was forced to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee about his political associations. During this, he admitted to ties to the Communist Party and that many of his more prominent students at Berkeley in the 1930s had also been official members of the party, but stated he had never been a member himself. Not much more came of the interrogation at this juncture, but 4 years later, in the early winter of 1953, the accusations against Oppenheimer were resurrected, and on this occasion, the FBI were convinced, wrongly as it turns out, that Oppenheimer was a Soviet asset operating within the US. Such was the level of paranoia which pertained within America at the time of the Second Red Scare. In mid-December 1953, Oppenheimer's security clearance for the US government was revoked, and he was advised to resign from his government positions. This Oppenheimer refused to do, and demanded a hearing, one which was held behind closed doors in the late spring of 1954. During this, Oppenheimer was completely undermined by his old colleague Edward Teller, who testified that he had found Oppenheimer's behavior questionable at times during his time as director of the Los Alamos laboratory. With this betrayal, Oppenheimer was stripped of his security clearance and cast into the political and social wilderness in the mid-1950s. The years following his security hearing and the revocation of his security clearance were difficult ones for Oppenheimer. The reaction within the academic community was mixed. Most of his colleagues defended Oppenheimer, But the bureaucrats and administrators who ran the American universities were often less sanguine, with many cancelling lectures and appearances which Oppenheimer was scheduled to give. Oppenheimer's own confidence was dented, and he refrained from overt involvement in numerous initiatives launched by figures like Einstein to warn the government and American society about the dangers of excessive nuclear proliferation. Instead, he spent an increasing amount of time away from the continental United States, relocating to the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, a U.S. overseas territory. Here, he purchased an estate on what was then known as Gibney Beach on the island of St. John, but which has since become known colloquially as Oppenheimer Beach. He spent extended periods here from 1957 onwards, though there were many institutions and organizations within America that continued to invite him to guest lecture. Yet, the 1950s were notably lean years for him from a research perspective, during which he barely published anything. By the late 1950s, there were concerted efforts underway to rehabilitate Oppenheimer abroad. For instance, in 1957, the French government awarded him the Légion d'honneur in recognition for his wartime service to the Allied cause. In 1962, he was made a foreign member of the Royal Society in Britain. By that time, there was an increasing awareness at home in America that the Second Red Scare had been utterly excessive in its prosecution of individuals who had been only vaguely associated with the American communist movement and had no real ties of any kind with the Soviet Union. Accordingly, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy moved to rehabilitate Oppenheimer by awarding him the Enrico Fermi Award, an award which had been created in 1956 by the U.S. Department of Energy and named in honor of Enrico Fermi, the Italian-American scientist who had developed the world's first nuclear reactor in Chicago in 1942 as part of the early stages of the Manhattan Project and who had died prematurely of stomach cancer in 1954. The award had been bestowed on several individuals who had worked at the Los Alamos laboratory under Oppenheimer between 1943 and 1945, including von Neumann, Bethe, and Teller in 1956, 1961, and 1962 respectively. Hence, Oppenheimer's receipt of the award in 1963 was belated but a welcome acknowledgement of the government's mistake in persecuting him as part of the Red Scare. Oppenheimer did not live long to enjoy having his reputation partially restored. 2 years after he was awarded the Fermi Award, he was diagnosed in late 1965 with throat cancer, an illness which was undoubtedly caused by his lifelong chain smoking. This was a time when many forms of cancer which are treatable today were effectively a death sentence. Thus, while Oppenheimer underwent aggressive chemotherapy in an effort to prolong his life, he fell into a coma early in 1967 and died at home in Princeton on the 18th of February. He was 62 years of age. While his reputation had been only partly rehabilitated by the bestowal of the Enrico Fermi Award in 1963, and many political figures continued to view him suspiciously, the academic community clearly demonstrated its respect for Oppenheimer at a funeral service which was attended by over 600 colleagues from within academia, the scientific community, and the military, a great many of whom had worked with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. His ashes were later deposited in the waters off St. John's Island in the Caribbean in an urn. In the decades since, his reputation has been fully rehabilitated. By way of contrast, Edward Teller, who testified against Oppenheimer at his closed-doors hearing in 1954, was spurned by many within the American scientific community for decades to come. In 1967, Oppenheimer was posthumously nominated for the third time for the Nobel Prize for Physics. He had previously been nominated in 1946 and 1951, but he had not received the accolade on those occasions, nor did he in 1967. There has been considerable attention given over the years as to why he did not receive the Nobel Prize, given his extensive accomplishments. But there would seem to be clear reasons why he did not. Firstly, Oppenheimer did not publish extensively, unlike someone like Albert Einstein, who published over 300 scientific papers during his lifetime and many books later in his life. By way of contrast, Oppenheimer published just 5 academic papers after the Second World War. Furthermore, while he contributed to numerous fields of inquiry within physics, he did not make the kind of theoretical or applied breakthrough in any one specific area which would have warranted a Nobel Prize. The Nobels are not awarded for a lifetime's work, but generally for a specific scientific accomplishment. Einstein, for instance, won his primarily for his work on the photoelectric effect. Hence, Oppenheimer was deemed not to have warranted a Nobel Prize for his individual contributions to science, though some have speculated that his work on gravitational collapse was worthy of one. His primary accomplishments throughout his career lay in collaborative work and overseeing teams of physicists and other scientists. It was this which made him the ideal individual to head the Los Alamos laboratory during the war. Robert Oppenheimer is one of the most important theoretical physicists in history. His research and work between the 1920s and 1960s added substantially to our understanding of the universe, notably the manner in which the Born-Oppenheimer approximation transformed our understanding of molecular dynamics from 1927 onwards, and how the Oppenheimer-Phillips process allowed for a deuteron-induced nuclear reaction after Oppenheimer and Melba Phillips provided an explanation for this phenomenon in 1935. But he will forever be remembered for his role in the Manhattan Project as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory. In this capacity, Oppenheimer might be said to have been the lead physicist in U.S. efforts to develop an atomic bomb during the Second World War. Whatever the existential and moral implications of the introduction of such weapons into the world might be, there is no doubt that this research was considered necessary in the context of the times. Oppenheimer was clearly troubled by what he and his colleagues had unleashed into the world, and spent much of the post-war period arguing against the development of even more deadly weapons of mass destruction. It was in part owing to this that he found himself persecuted and prosecuted by the government he had worked for in the early 1950s, and cast into the wilderness as a result of the Second Red Scare. His legacy, though, is alive and well today, an eccentric man who viewed the physical universe in mystical terms. Oppenheimer should surely be remembered as one of the great scientists of modern times. What do you think of Robert Oppenheimer? Was he the most significant individual involved in the Manhattan Project? And should he have been awarded a Nobel Prize? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.